I was sent to a restricted zone in Turkey until the alien revealed what happened to Noah's Ark. The phone screamed at 2:47 a.m., cutting through the darkness of my Tennessee apartment like a knife through flesh. I knew before answering it wasn't a wrong number, not with that specific ringtone, the one reserved for encrypted military channels that technically didn't exist. "Staff Sergeant Holloway," I answered, already swinging my legs out of bed, feet hitting cold hardwood. The voice on the other end was Colonel Patterson, though he didn't identify himself. Didn't need to after 12 years of taking orders from that gravelly drawl. "You have 90 minutes to be at Incirlik Air Base, Turkey. Pack light. Essential gear only. Leave your personal cell phone, your laptop, any device with GPS or internet connectivity." My mouth opened to ask the obvious questions, but Patterson cut me off with 3 words that made my blood crystallize. Umbra/keyhole. That wasn't just classified. That was compartmentalized above top secret. The kind of clearance that makes careers disappear if you talk about it. I'd heard rumors about Umbra operations, whispers in Kabul about recovery teams sent to retrieve anomalous materials from conflict zones, but I'd never been read into one. 90 minutes later, I was wheels up on a C-130 Hercules out of Dover Air Force Base. No civilian flight records, no manifest, nothing but 6 other soldiers strapped into red webbing seats and the deafening roar of turboprops. None of us made eye contact. That was the first rule of black operations. Don't ask questions you don't want answered. The guy across from me had the 1,000-yard stare of someone who'd seen things that don't make it into after-action reports, his fingers unconsciously tracing the outline of a cross pendant under his uniform. To my left sat a female sergeant, maybe 25, with tactical medic patches and hands that wouldn't stop shaking despite her locked jaw and rigid posture. We flew in silence for 7 hours, the kind of oppressive quiet that makes your own thoughts sound like screaming, each of us alone with whatever demons or doubts we'd packed alongside our gear. Somewhere over the Atlantic, a loadmaster handed out tablets, military grade, hardened against EMP, loaded with a single encrypted document. The briefing was sparse, clinical, deliberately vague in that way that tells you more by what it doesn't say than what it does. "Operation Threshold," the document read. White text on black background burning into my retinas. Joint U.S.-Turkish recovery operation. Target: anomalous structural object, Mount Ararat restricted zone, elevation 13,800 feet. Classification: Umbra, keyhole. Mission parameters: extraction and documentation of object for transport to secure facility. Duration: 48, 72 hours maximum. Rules of engagement: defensive only unless explicitly authorized by CENTCOM. Hazard assessment: unknown biological, unknown environmental, potential hostile territorial actors. That last line made my skin crawl. Unknown biological could mean anything from toxic mold to something that required a flamethrower and a prayer. I'd done CBRN training, chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear, but unknown meant the people writing this briefing had no idea what we were walking into, and that terrified me more than any enemy combatant. Mount Ararat itself raised red flags. That was Armenian-Turkish border territory, politically sensitive, militarily restricted, the kind of place where you could start an international incident just by taking a piss on the wrong side of a rock. But the phrase that kept circling back, that made my gut twist, was anomalous structural object. Military doesn't use words like anomalous unless something doesn't fit established reality. The C-130 landed at Incirlik just before dawn, Turkish time. The sun barely a promise on the eastern horizon as we deplaned into cold. That bit through my jacket like teeth. Incirlik Air Base was a sprawling joint operation facility, home to both US Air Force and Turkish military, a strategic asset that had been leveraged for everything from Cold War surveillance to Middle Eastern operations. But we weren't processed through normal channels. No customs, no check-in, just a black Suburban with diplomatic plates and tinted windows waiting on the tarmac. The driver never spoke, never even looked at us through the rearview mirror, just drove with the mechanical precision of someone following GPS coordinates burned into their brain. We passed through 3 separate security checkpoints, each more remote than the last, until the paved roads gave way to gravel, then dirt, then nothing but tire tracks through scrubland. The landscape looked biblical, ancient, like God himself had forgotten to finish painting this corner of the world. All ochre stone and sparse vegetation, mountains rising in the distance like the knuckles of a buried giant. We arrived at a forward operating base that wasn't on any map, just a cluster of military tents and prefab structures surrounded by razor wire and Turkish soldiers with AK-47s who looked at us like we were contamination. A makeshift helipad occupied the center of the compound, where two UH-60 Blackhawks sat with rotors already spinning, pilots visible through cockpit glass making final pre-flight checks. That's when I saw them. Two civilian scientists being escorted toward the helicopters, not walking voluntarily but being physically guided by military police, their hands zip-tied behind their backs. One was a woman, maybe 40, wearing field gear that looked expensive and out of place. The other was a man in his 60s, Middle Eastern features, glasses askew, and blood, fresh bright red blood, streaming from his mouth and nose. He was shouting something, voice raw and desperate, fighting against the MPs who outweighed him by 100 pounds each. I couldn't hear the words over rotor wash at first, just saw his mouth forming shapes, saw the wild terror in his eyes that had nothing to do with physical restraint. Then the wind shifted, and his voice cut through clear as a church bell on Sunday morning. "You don't understand. You can't drill into it. You can't wake it up." The MPs shoved him harder, one of them pressing something against his neck. A taser, I realized, and the scientist went rigid, then slack, unconscious before he even hit the ground. They dragged him like a sack of grain toward the Blackhawk, his heels cutting lines in the dirt, blood from his mouth leaving a trail behind him like breadcrumbs. The female scientist screamed his name, "Rashid! Rashid!" before another MP clamped a hand over her mouth and forced her into the second helicopter. Nobody explained what had just happened. Nobody acknowledged that we'd witnessed anything unusual. Colonel Patterson appeared from one of the prefab structures, aviator sunglasses reflecting the rising sun, jaw set in that way that meant questions would not be tolerated. "Holloway, you're on bird 1. Wheels up in 5. Briefing continues en route." That was it. No context, no reassurance. Just orders delivered with the expectation of absolute obedience. I climbed into the Blackhawk, strapping into a seat still warm from whoever had occupied it before me, and watched through the open door as Turkish ground crew loaded equipment I didn't recognize. Cylindrical containers marked with biohazard symbols, drilling equipment that looked more like something from an oil rig than a military operation, and cases, locked, metallic cases with alphanumeric codes stenciled on the sides. The rotors spun faster, that distinctive whoomp-whoomp-whoomp building to a scream as we lifted off, leaving the forward base behind, climbing toward mountains that suddenly seemed less like geology and more like monuments to something mankind had been warned to leave alone. Through my headset, Patterson's voice crackled. "What you're about to see stays buried. You'll sign NDAs that make your enlistment oath look like a birthday card. You talk, you disappear, not metaphorically, not bureaucratically. You just stop existing. Understood?" 5 voices confirmed in unison, mine among them, though my throat felt like I'd swallowed sand. Below us, the landscape grew more hostile, more vertical, patches of snow appearing like skin disease on the mountain's flanks. And in the distance, rising above everything else like a judgment, Mount Ararat, 5,137 meters of volcanic rock and glacial ice, the mountain where, according to Sunday school stories I'd stopped believing years ago, Noah's Ark had come to rest after God drowned the world. I'd always thought that was just metaphor, mythology, Bronze Age people trying to explain geology they didn't understand. But the scientist's blood-streaked face kept flashing in my mind, his desperate warning echoing louder than the helicopter's turbines. "You can't wake it up." Wake what up? What the hell could be sleeping on a mountain that's been frozen for millennia? The Blackhawk banked hard, angling toward a glacial shelf I could barely distinguish from the surrounding ice, and that's when I saw it. The excavation site, a wound carved into the mountain's flesh, surrounded by lights and equipment and tiny figures that from this altitude looked like ants worshipping at the foot of something vast and dark, something that wasn't supposed to exist, something that, despite every rational bone in my body screaming otherwise, looked exactly like the hull of a ship. The Blackhawk pitched violently as we hit the mountain's thermal layer, where warm air rising from the valleys collided with Arctic winds, screaming down from the summit, creating turbulence that threw us against our restraints like rag dolls. Through the cockpit windscreen I could see nothing but white. Not clouds, not fog, but a blizzard so dense it looked like we were flying through static, through the space between television channels where reality breaks down into noise. The pilot's voice crackled through my headset. tension evident despite professional calm. Visibility 00, navigating by instruments only, ETA to LZ 3 minutes. 3 minutes felt like 3 hours as the helicopter bucked and shuddered, the airframe groaning with stress, my stomach climbing into my throat with every sudden drop. Across from me, one of the other soldiers, a kid who couldn't have been more than 22, was vomiting into a bag, his face the color of old milk, while next to him, a grizzled sergeant first class gripped his rifle like a lifeline and stared at nothing with eyes that had seen too many insertions go wrong. I tried to focus on my breathing, the combat meditation techniques they'd drilled into us during airborne training, but my mind kept returning to that scientist's warning, to the blood streaming from his mouth, to the word wake. Then I noticed her, the woman they'd forced onto our helicopter, the civilian scientist who'd been screaming the other man's name before they'd muzzled her. She sat in the back corner, wrists still zip-tied in front of her, but no one was actively guarding her now, because where the hell could she go at 13,000 feet in a blizzard? Her field jacket bore a patch I recognized. USGS, United States Geological Survey, though something about the styling looked off, like it was meant to appear official while actually being anything but. She was maybe 40, Asian features suggesting Chinese or Korean heritage, hair pulled back in a practical bun that had partially come loose during the struggle, and her hands, God, her hands were shaking so badly she had to clasp them together to keep them still. Our eyes met across the cabin, and in that moment, I saw something that made my training, my weapons, my 12 years of service feel suddenly, terrifyingly inadequate. I saw a scientist, a person who dealt in facts and evidence and peer-reviewed certainty, completely and utterly terrified of what those facts had revealed. She leaned forward, shouting over the rotor noise, her voice barely audible even in the relative quiet of our headsets. "Sergeant, are you religious?" The question caught me so off guard I almost laughed. Almost. Except there was nothing funny about the desperation in her eyes. The way she asked it like my answer might determine whether we all lived or died. "Was!" I shouted back, which was true enough. I'd grown up Southern Baptist in Chattanooga, Sunday school and vacation Bible school, and the whole 9 yards. But somewhere between Kandahar and Mosul, I'd lost whatever faith I'd started with, watched it bleed out in the same sand that soaked up too many good men's blood. She nodded like she'd expected that answer, like maybe she'd asked that same question of herself and gotten the same response, then leaned closer, close enough that I could smell coffee on her breath and see the tiny broken capillaries in her eyes from crying or stress or both. "Then pray you can get it back," she said, voice cracking on the last word. "Because where we're going, what we're about to see, you're going to need faith in something, anything, or what you witness will break you." Before I could ask what the hell she meant, the helicopter dropped suddenly, a controlled descent that still felt like falling, and the loadmaster was screaming 30 seconds to LZ, and we were all checking weapons and gear with the automatic efficiency of people who've done this 100 times before. The skids touched down on what I later learned was a reinforced steel platform they'd anchored directly into the glacial ice, a landing zone barely large enough for the Blackhawk's footprint, wind hitting us with physical force the moment the crew chief slid the door open. Temperature readout on my watch, -23 Celsius, cold enough that the moisture in my nostrils froze with the first breath, cold that went through tactical gear like we were wearing tissue paper. Wind speed had to be pushing 80, maybe 90 kilometers per hour, strong enough that I had to lean into it just to stay upright as we offloaded, following light sticks that marked a path through whiteness so complete it felt like walking through milk. The woman scientist, I still didn't know her name, stumbled coming off the helicopter and would have gone face first into ice if I hadn't grabbed her arm, steadying her despite the zip ties, and she looked at me with something that might have been gratitude or might have been pity. We formed a line, each person gripping the shoulder of the one in front, a human chain shuffling through the blizzard towards structures I could barely distinguish from the snow, military tents, prefab shelters, equipment covered in frost and ice. 400 meters, the briefing had said, but it felt like 4,000. Every step a negotiation with wind trying to throw us off the mountain, with cold trying to freeze the blood in our veins. Then suddenly, we were out of the worst of it, ducking through a thermal curtain into a tent heated by industrial propane burners, the temperature differential so extreme that my goggles fogged instantly, and I had to rip them off just to see. 20, maybe 30 people filled the space. Soldiers, technicians, more scientists with that same haunted look the woman had, everyone moving with the purposeful urgency of people racing against a clock only they could hear. Someone cut the zip ties off the woman's wrists, handed her a thermal mug of something steaming, and she drank it like it was salvation while I tried to process the organized chaos around us. Maps covered every surface, topographical surveys, ground-penetrating radar imagery, thermal scans showing something massive embedded in the ice, something with straight lines and right angles that geology doesn't produce naturally. Colonel Patterson appeared from an inner tent, still wearing those goddamn aviator sunglasses despite being indoors, and gestured for our squad to gather around a portable holographic display that showed the mountain's interior in three-dimensional detail. "Gentlemen, and Dr. Chen," he nodded at the woman. Apparently that was her name. "Welcome to Operation Threshold. What you're about to see is classified at levels that would make the Manhattan Project look like a high school science fair." Patterson manipulated the hologram, zooming into a section of the mountain where the radar had painted something that made my breath catch despite the warm air, despite every rational thought trying to reject what my eyes were seeing. A structure, massive and intact, buried under 60 feet of glacial ice and volcanic debris, its dimensions rendered in precise green lines against the mountain's irregular red geology. Preliminary excavation began 14 months ago after Turkish military satellite imagery detected thermal anomalies inconsistent with volcanic activity, Patterson continued, his voice carrying that briefing room monotone that made apocalyptic information sound like a weather report. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed a non-natural structure at depth. Initial samples retrieved 3 months ago carbon-dated to approximately 2300 BCE, plus or minus 60 years, preserved in glacial ice in near-perfect condition. Material analysis revealed wood species consistent with ancient Mesopotamian cypress, treated with a bitumen-based sealant that shouldn't exist in that region or time period. He paused, making sure we were all tracking, making sure the implications were sinking in like cold water through cracked boots. Yesterday at 400 hours, seismic sensors detected movement from inside the structure. Not settling, not thermal expansion. Rhythmic movement, consistent with biological activity. That's why you're here. Dr. Chen spoke up then, her voice steadier now but still carrying an edge of barely controlled panic. The structure's dimensions are 137 meters long, 22.9 meters wide, 13.7 meters tall. For those of you who didn't grow up memorizing Bible verses, that's exactly 300 by 50 by 30 cubits, the precise measurements given in Genesis 6:15 for Noah's Ark. The temperature in the tent seemed to drop despite the heaters, despite the insulated walls, because even those of us who'd stopped believing years ago knew those numbers, had heard them in Sunday school between juice boxes and goldfish crackers, had seen them illustrated in children's books with cute animals and rainbows. But this wasn't a children's book. This was ground-penetrating radar showing something real, something physical, something that shouldn't exist buried in a mountain that biblical tradition had always claimed as the Ark's final resting place. One of the soldiers, the kid who'd been vomiting earlier, made a sound halfway between a laugh and a sob. "You're saying we found Noah's fucking Ark? Like the actual Ark?" Chen didn't answer, just pulled out a tablet and swiped through images that made my skin crawl. Close-up photos of the wood surface showing tool marks, showing construction techniques that belonged in museums, showing Hebrew letters carved into structural beams. "Dr. Chen is our lead geologist and historical materials expert," Patterson cut in, reclaiming control of the briefing. "She's been on site since excavation began. Dr. Rashid, the other civilian you saw during insertion, was our theological consultant and ancient Near Eastern languages specialist, until he suffered a psychological break approximately 6 hours ago and had to be evacuated. That was a sanitized way of saying until he started screaming warnings and bleeding from his mouth. But I let it slide because Patterson was still talking, still showing us images that each felt like a small bomb detonating in my worldview. The structure is partially exposed now, approximately 30% accessible through our main excavation shaft. We've established a forward research station inside, powered by portable generators, heated to maintain stable temperature for preservation and human operation. Your mission is to provide security during the final excavation phase and to assist with extraction of a specimen. He said that word, specimen, like it was normal, like we were here to bag up some pottery shards instead of whatever the hell was inside an impossible boat on an impossible mountain. that our sensors indicate is located in a sealed chamber approximately 12 meters below the current excavation level. We geared up in silence, pulling on additional thermal layers, checking weapons that suddenly seemed inadequate. What were 56-meter rounds going to do against something that had survived 4,000 years in ice, against something that a trained theologian had called it, with such terror his body had rejected the knowledge violently? Dr. Chen approached me while I was loading fresh magazines, her hands still trembling but her eyes clearer now, focused with the intensity of someone who'd made a decision. "Sergeant Holloway," she said, reading my name tape, "I need you to understand something before we go down there. I've got a PhD from MIT, 20 years of fieldwork on 6 continents, published papers in every major geological journal. I've excavated Bronze Age sites, analyzed core samples from Antarctica, consulted on projects that rewrote geological timelines." She took a breath, seeming to gather courage for whatever came next. "And nothing in my education, my training, my entire scientific career prepared me for what's down there. The structure alone is impossible. The engineering, the preservation, the location. But what's inside it? What we've detected with thermal imaging and acoustic sensors?" She trailed off, looking toward the tent exit, where snow devils spun in the wind beyond. Dr. Rashid spent 3 weeks translating inscriptions we found on the interior walls. The last thing he translated, right before he broke, was carved into a support beam near the sealed chamber. It said, "Here sleeps the witness, until the waters are forgotten and men need reminding." Then he started bleeding and screaming that we had to leave, that we couldn't wake it, that God had sealed it there for a reason. The walk from the heated tent to the excavation site took 10 minutes through snow that had eased to mere flurries, visibility improving enough that I could see the scope of the operation, floodlights on scaffolding towers illuminating an area the size of a football field, carved into the mountain's flank like a surgical wound. Dozens of workers moved through the light, ant-like in their repetitive tasks, while Turkish soldiers in cold weather gear patrolled the perimeter with AK-47s held ready, not pointed at anything specific, but ready nonetheless, watching the darkness beyond the lights like they expected something to come crawling out. The excavation itself was a glacial crevasse that had been widened and reinforced with steel beams and insulated panels, creating a descending tunnel that led into the mountain's frozen heart. As we approached the entrance, I felt it. A change in air pressure, a subtle wrongness that made my ears pop and my teeth ache. The same feeling you get before a thunderstorm when the atmosphere itself seems to hold its breath. And there, at the tunnel's mouth, visible even from 50 meters away through swirling snow, was wood, blackened, ancient wood that shouldn't exist, that no wooden structure should survive intact after 4,000 years, rising from the ice like the ribs of some massive beast. Dr. Chen touched my arm, pointing toward a section where the structure was most exposed, where you could see the craftsmanship, the joints fitted with such precision that 4 millennia of ice and pressure hadn't split them. "Look at the dimensions again," she whispered, pulling up her tablet to show the measurements overlaid on the physical structure. 137 meters by 22.9 by 13.7, exactly 300 by 50 by 30 cubits. And she looked at me with eyes that had seen too much and couldn't unsee it. "Sergeant, I don't know if you believe in God, in the Bible, in any of it, but the math doesn't lie, the carbon dating doesn't lie, and the thermal signatures coming from that sealed chamber." She pulled up another scan, showing a heat bloom in the structure's center, something warm and alive where everything should be frozen and dead. Those don't lie either. It's the Ark, the actual biblical impossible Ark, and there's something alive inside it. The thermal tent they'd erected inside the main excavation chamber was a marvel of engineering. Triple-layered insulated walls creating a pressurized environment, warm enough that we could strip down to base layers, sophisticated enough that condensation was vented automatically to prevent ice buildup that could compromise structural integrity. It should have felt safe, comfortable even, a bubble of civilization carved into the mountain's frozen heart. Instead, it felt like a coffin, like we were sealed inside something that didn't want us there, breathing recycled air that tasted faintly of propane and fear, and the indefinable wrongness that permeated everything about this operation. They'd set up cots in rows, military efficient, but nobody was sleeping despite the exhaustion that pulled at our bones after 18 hours of travel and acclimatization. I lay on my assigned rack, staring at the tent ceiling where LED strip lights created a pale imitation of daylight. and tried not to think about the Sunday school lessons from my childhood. The felt-board stories where Noah was a kindly old man with a white beard, and the ark was a colorful boat full of smiling giraffes and elephants walking up a ramp 2 by 2. That version had rainbows and happy endings, God's promise that he'd never flood the world again. A children's story sanitized of the horror of what a global deluge actually meant. Every human being outside that boat drowning, cities submerged, civilizations erased, the screaming silenced by water, until only 8 people remained alive on an entire planet. This wasn't that story. This was industrial, ancient, terrifying in its physical reality. The section of the structure visible through the tent's reinforced window port showed wood that had been worked by tools I didn't recognize, joined with techniques that engineers said shouldn't exist in the Bronze Age, sealed with bitumen that chemical analysis suggested was mixed with compounds we couldn't identify. The scale alone was overwhelming. Even partially exposed, the ark's hull rose 30 feet above the excavation floor, curving upward in a shape that hydrodynamic computer models said was impossibly perfect for surviving massive waves, more efficient than modern ship designs despite being conceived over 4,000 years ago by a man who'd never seen an ocean. I'd read the briefing materials during the helicopter flight, scanned the technical reports that Dr. Chen and her team had compiled, and every page screamed the same impossible truth. This shouldn't exist. Couldn't exist. Yet here it was, solid and real and utterly undeniable. Around me, the other soldiers dealt with insomnia in their own ways. Sergeant First Class Rodriguez quietly cleaned his rifle for the 3rd time. The medic, whose name I'd learned was Corporal Williams, reviewed medical protocols on a tablet. The young private who'd vomited earlier just stared at the ceiling and mouthed what might have been prayers or might have been profanity, lips moving soundlessly. At 23:47 hours, I remember the exact time because I was watching my watch, counting seconds, trying to use the mechanical passage of time to anchor myself to rationality. The seismic sensors went off. Not alarms, not yet. Just a sudden spike on the monitoring equipment that made the technician on duty sit up straighter, lean closer to his screens, then reach for the comms unit with hands that moved too quickly to be casual. Command, this is Monitoring Station Alpha. We have seismic activity. Advise. He stopped mid-sentence, staring at his readouts like they'd betrayed him, then continued with a voice pitched higher than before. Command. Seismic activity is not consistent with ice shift or thermal expansion. Pattern is rhythmic, originating from 12 meters below current excavation level, inside the structure itself. Frequency is... Jesus Christ, frequency is 0.8 hertz, duration 2.3 seconds, interval 3.1 seconds. I didn't need a geology degree to understand what that meant. What pattern matches those specifications? Breathing. Something inside that wooden tomb, sealed under ice and stone for 43 centuries, was breathing. The tent erupted into controlled chaos. Soldiers grabbing weapons and gear with muscle memory. Scientists rushing to secondary monitoring stations. Everyone moving with purpose while trying desperately not to acknowledge the existential terror of what those sensors were reporting. Colonel Patterson's face appeared on the main communications screen within 90 seconds. Satellite uplink from wherever he'd returned to after our insertion, his expression invisible behind those ever-present aviator glasses, despite the fact that he was clearly indoors and it was the middle of the night. "Report," he snapped, and the lead technician, a civilian contractor whose badge said his name was Morrison, ran through the data with admirable composure considering he was basically announcing that something impossible was breathing inside an impossible boat. Patterson listened in silence, then delivered orders in that same flat monotone that made apocalyptic commands sound routine. "Accelerate drilling operations. I want that chamber breached within 48 hours maximum. Russian Cosmos satellites pass over this region in 51 hours, and we cannot risk international exposure before we've secured the asset." Asset. That's what he called whatever was breathing down there, reducing something that had survived since the Bronze Age to a piece of equipment to be recovered and catalogued. "Sir," Morrison ventured, showing more courage than I'd have credited. Dr. Rashid's psychological break occurred after he translated inscriptions warning against opening the sealed chamber. "Perhaps we should..." Patterson cut him off with a gesture that looked casual but carried command weight. Dr. Rashid suffered altitude sickness and psychological stress. His translations have been reviewed by other experts who found no such warnings, only historical documentation. "We proceed as planned." That was a lie. I'd seen Dr. Chen's face when Patterson said it, saw the way her expression went carefully blank in the manner of people who know contradicting a superior officer will accomplish nothing except getting themselves removed from the operation. After Patterson signed off and the tent settled into uneasy watchfulness, I found Chen near the equipment lockers, staring at a tablet displaying what I recognized as photographs of ancient text, her fingers trembling slightly as they traced symbols I couldn't read. "He's lying," she said without looking up. Without any preamble, voice pitched low enough that only I could hear over the hum of generators and environmental systems. Rashid didn't suffer altitude sickness. He was down here in this tent, at ground level essentially, pressurized atmosphere, perfect conditions. And there were no other experts reviewing his translations because he was the only person on this operation who could read Proto-Hebraic and Akkadian cuneiform, the only one with the specialization we needed. She finally looked at me, and I saw in her eyes the same thing I'd seen during the helicopter flight. Not fear of physical danger, but something deeper, existential. The terror of having the foundations of your worldview cracked open to reveal something vast and terrible underneath. He translated 17 inscriptions before he broke. 16 of them were historical, documentation of construction, lists of animals, records of who survived. But the 17th, carved into the support beam directly above the sealed chamber, said exactly what I told you before. Here sleeps the witness, until the waters are forgotten and men need reminding. She pulled up another image, this one showing the inscription in question. And even though I couldn't read the ancient letters, I could see they'd been carved with different tools than the surrounding text. Deeper, more deliberate, like whoever wrote them wanted to ensure they'd last forever. Rashid said the word used for witness wasn't the normal Hebrew ed, but something older, a term that appears in apocryphal texts, referring to angels who watched over early creation, who were sent to observe and record, but not interfere. Chen's voice dropped even lower, barely a whisper. The Book of Enoch, not canonical, not in most Bibles, but preserved in Ethiopian Orthodox tradition, talks about watchers, angels who descended to earth before the flood, some of whom stayed faithful to God, while others rebelled and corrupted humanity. Rashid believed that whatever is in that chamber is one of the faithful ones, sealed there voluntarily as a witness to what actually happened during the deluge, preserved until... She stopped abruptly as footsteps approached, shoving the tablet into her jacket and turning away, but not before I saw tears tracking down her face, freezing in the cold air that leaked through imperfect seals. The footsteps belonged to a Turkish officer I hadn't been introduced to, who informed us in accented English that drilling operations would commence in 4 hours, and all non-essential personnel should remain in sleeping quarters during the procedure. Sleep was impossible after that. Impossible for me, impossible for most of the tent's occupants if their restless movements and whispered conversations were any indication. I gave up trying around 02:30 and pulled on my outer layers, intending to step outside for air despite the cold, needing to see stars or mountains or anything that wasn't the claustrophobic confines of our pressurized bubble. That's when I noticed Chen wasn't on her cot anymore, wasn't anywhere in the sleeping area, and something, instinct maybe, or recognition that she was spiraling into a dangerous mental state, made me go looking for her. I found her in the observation area, kneeling on the metal grating that overlooked the exposed section of the Ark's hull, and she was praying. Not casually, not the comfortable church prayers of habit and routine, but the desperate supplication of someone begging for answers or forgiveness, or maybe just understanding. Her hands clasped so tightly around a silver crucifix that her knuckles had gone white. I'd seen combat veterans pray like that, in moments when incoming fire was too close and body armor felt too thin, when faith was the only armor left. Tears were freezing on her face, literally crystallizing on her cheeks and eyelashes despite the environmental heating, and she didn't seem to notice or care that I was there until I spoke. "Do you actually believe?" I asked, the question coming out harsher than I'd intended. Skepticism born from 12 years of watching people die despite their faith, despite their prayers, despite their absolute certainty that God would protect them. "Believe in what?" she replied without looking up, without stopping the movement of her lips in silent prayer. "In God? In the flood? In all of it?" I clarified, gesturing at the wooden structure below us that represented either the greatest archaeological discovery in human history or proof that everything we thought we understood about ancient history was fundamentally wrong. Chen finally stopped praying, lowered her hands but kept the crucifix pressed between her palms, and when she looked at me, Her expression carried the weight of someone who'd been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about herself. "I didn't want to believe, Sergeant. I spent 20 years building a career on rationalism, on empirical evidence, on peer-reviewed methodology that left no room for faith or superstition or anything that couldn't be measured and quantified. When they brought me onto this project 14 months ago, I was excited about the historical significance, but convinced we'd find a natural explanation: timber from an ancient settlement, geological formations that resembled construction, something explainable within established scientific paradigms." She stood, joints creaking from kneeling on frozen metal, and moved to lean against the railing separating us from a 30-foot drop to the excavation floor. "But the data, Sergeant. The data doesn't care what I believe or don't believe, doesn't bend to accommodate comfortable explanations. Carbon dating gives us 2,348 BCE, plus or minus 67 years, which places this structure exactly when biblical chronology says the flood occurred. The wood is Cupressus sempervirens, Mediterranean cypress that shouldn't exist in this region, but matches exactly what Genesis describes as gopher wood. Mistranslation, Rashid said. Original term means resinous wood. The bitumen sealant contains compounds we can't synthesize even with modern chemistry. A mixture so perfect that after 4,300 years, the seams are still waterproof where we've tested them. She was crying openly now, past caring who saw, past maintaining professional composure. The dimensions aren't just close to biblical specifications, they're exact, 300 by 50 by 30 cubits, using the Egyptian royal cubit of 20.6 inches, giving us precisely the measurements we've confirmed with laser scanning. The engineering is beyond Bronze Age capabilities by centuries, with hydrodynamic efficiency that our computer models say shouldn't be possible without modern naval architecture. Her voice cracked, forcing her to pause and gather herself. "So yes, Sergeant Holloway, I believe. Not because I want to, not because it's comfortable or fits my worldview, but because the evidence demands it. And if the Ark is real, then the flood was real. Then God is real. Then everything—" She gestured at the structure below us, at the mountain around us, at the universe itself. "Everything is different than I thought." She turned to face me fully, gripping my arm with surprising strength, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. "And if all of that is real, if this is genuinely Noah's Ark preserved by God as evidence, then we're not archaeologists documenting history. We're desecrators violating a sacred site. We're drilling into the last physical proof of God's judgment, the vessel that saved 8 human beings while the rest of the world drowned for their corruption. And we're doing it not to learn or honor, but to extract an asset for military study." She released my arm, stumbling backward slightly, exhaustion and emotion making her unsteady. Rashid understood that before he broke. He realized we weren't discovering God's mercy. We were witnessing the preserved evidence of his wrath. And worse, we were about to wake up whatever he left here as a witness to that wrath. The inscription said, "Until the waters are forgotten and men need reminding." Sergeant, we've forgotten. We turned the flood into a children's story with cartoon animals. We forgot that it was judgment, purification, God saying, "I will erase what I created because it has become too corrupted to save." And now we're here, with our drills and our sensors and our military precision, about to remind ourselves why he sealed something inside this tomb 43 centuries ago. Below us, I could hear the drilling team preparing their equipment, testing thermal lances that would cut through ancient wood and ice like surgical instruments, and somewhere deep in the structure something was breathing, waiting, and I wondered if Dr. Sarah Chen was right to pray. Hour 36 of the operation arrived with the grinding scream of thermal lances cutting through millennia of compressed ice and petrified wood, a sound that seemed to violate the mountain itself, turning silence into industrial violence. I'd been awake for 28 hours straight by that point, surviving on military-grade stimulants and the adrenaline that comes from knowing you're about to cross a threshold that can't be uncrossed, about to see something that will fundamentally alter your understanding of reality. The drilling team had been working in 6-hour shifts, rotating crews to maintain precision and prevent exhaustion-induced mistakes, but none of them looked rested. They all had the same haunted expression, the same unconscious habit of glancing toward the sealed chamber like it might suddenly burst open on its own. The thermal lances operated at 2,000 degrees Celsius, hot enough to vaporize ice instantly and char wood to ash. Guided by ground-penetrating radar, with millimeter precision, to avoid damaging whatever lay beyond. Dr. Chen stood at the monitoring station, watching readouts that tracked temperature, atmospheric composition, structural integrity, her fingers dancing across keyboards with the frantic energy of someone trying to maintain scientific detachment while internally screaming. She'd stopped praying after our conversation, or at least stopped doing it publicly, but I'd caught her touching the crucifix under her jacket compulsively, a nervous tick that betrayed the faith she'd tried so hard to rationalize away. At 4:15 hours exactly, I know because I was checking my watch obsessively, counting seconds like they might somehow slow down or reverse if I paid enough attention. The lead driller's voice crackled through the comm system with barely contained excitement. Breakthrough, breakthrough, we've penetrated the final barrier. Thermal lance is through into open space beyond. The monitoring station erupted with activity. Chen and her team analyzing data streaming from sensors they'd pushed through the drill hole, and what they found made them go silent in a way that was worse than screaming. Atmospheric composition is wrong, Chen said finally, her voice carrying that same careful professional tone that people use when describing catastrophic findings. We're reading oxygen levels at 32% compared to our current 21%. Carbon dioxide is lower, trace gases that shouldn't exist naturally, and temperature, Jesus, temperature inside the chamber is 15 degrees Celsius, well above freezing despite being surrounded by glacial ice. She looked up from her screens, met my eyes with an expression that communicated volumes without words. This was impossible. This violated thermodynamics. This was preservation beyond any natural process. Air pressure is higher too, approximately 3 atmospheres, like the chamber was sealed under pressure and held it for 4,000 years. And there's something else. She trailed off, fingers flying across keyboards, pulling up spectroscopic analysis that meant nothing to me but everything to her. Organic compounds in the air, complex proteins, amino acid chains that match human cellular structure. Something in there is breathing. The hazmat team went in first. 4 specialists in positive pressure suits that made them look like astronauts exploring an alien world, carrying atmospheric samplers and biosafety equipment that suggested they expected biological contamination. I followed 10 meters behind with 3 other soldiers, rifles raised despite knowing that bullets were probably useless against whatever we were about to find, falling back on training because training was the only thing keeping existential terror at manageable levels. The drill had created a circular entrance 2 meters in diameter, edges still glowing faintly from residual heat, opening into darkness that our tactical lights struggled to penetrate. Not natural darkness, but something that seemed to actively resist illumination that swallowed our LED beams and gave back only reluctant shadows. The smell hit me first, before I'd even fully entered the chamber, a scent so overwhelming and contradictory that my brain couldn't process it. Sweet like honey and flowers, but simultaneously putrid like rotting meat, both competing for dominance in my olfactory system and creating a nauseating combination that made my stomach clench. One of the hazmat specialists vomited inside his helmet, forcing him to retreat immediately before he drowned in his own sick, while the others pushed forward with visible effort. Then my boots hit the chamber floor and I could see what we'd opened, could see what had been sealed here since the Bronze Age, and understanding why Dr. Rashid had started bleeding became suddenly, terrifyingly clear. The chamber was perfect, not in an aesthetic sense, but mathematically, geometrically perfect, in a way that human hands shouldn't achieve without modern tools and laser measurements. Walls rose in curves that my engineering-trained eye recognized as optimal for pressure distribution, meeting ceiling arches that distributed weight with the efficiency of Gothic cathedrals built 3,000 years after this structure. The wood itself looked wrong, too smooth, too uniform, like it had been grown rather than cut, shaped by some process that left no tool marks, no saw lines, no evidence of human craftsmanship despite clearly being artificial construction. But what made my breath catch, what made even the hardened hazmat specialists stop and stare, were the symbols covering every surface, carved into walls and floor and ceiling in precise lines that caught and reflected our lights in ways that normal indentations shouldn't, glowing faintly with what might have been bioluminescence or might have been something our science didn't have names for. Dr. Chen squeezed through the entrance behind me, medical mask over her face, tablet already out and photographing everything with desperate speed, and I heard her breath catch in exactly the way mine had when understanding hit. "It's not Hebrew," she whispered, moving closer to the nearest wall. fingers hovering millimeters from the surface but not quite touching, maintaining archaeological protocols even in this impossible situation. It's not cuneiform, not Egyptian hieroglyphics, not any writing system I've ever studied, and I've spent 20 years analyzing ancient scripts from every civilization we know existed in this region. She traced the air above one series of symbols, following their flow with professional expertise, and I could see her brain working, comparing what she saw to thousands of examples stored in memory. Wait, there are elements, structural components that remind me of Proto-Sinaitic, the earliest Semitic alphabet from around 1800 BCE. But this is older, much older. And there's something else, organizational patterns that match Proto-Hebrew, but Proto-Hebrew was derived from Phoenician, which was derived from earlier Canaanite scripts. And this looks like it might be what they were derived from. She pulled up comparison images on her tablet, ancient alphabets displayed side by side with the symbols surrounding us, and the resemblance was clear but distant, like seeing a great-grandfather's features in a child's face. Sergeant, if these inscriptions predate all known writing systems in this region, that would place them before 3000 BCE, potentially before the Bronze Age entirely. And according to biblical chronology, she stopped, swallowed hard, forced herself to continue. That would place them before the Tower of Babel, before God confused human language and scattered the peoples. This might be the original language, the one tongue spoken by all humanity before divine intervention fractured it. Before I could respond, before my brain could even begin processing the implications of standing inside a chamber where the walls were inscribed in humanity's first language, the hazmat team leader's voice crackled urgently through comms. Center of the chamber, 30 meters from entry point. We have a contact. Not sure what I'm looking at. Requesting immediate backup and scientific assessment. We moved as a unit. Tactical formation maintaining spacing and lines of fire. Lights sweeping ahead to illuminate what our sensors had detected, but our eyes hadn't yet confirmed. Then the beams converged on the chamber's center, and I understood immediately why the team leader couldn't describe what he was seeing. Because language, even technical military language trained for precision under stress, had no adequate terms for this. It was ice, translucent crystalline ice that somehow remained frozen despite the chamber's above-zero temperature, formed into a cocoon or chrysalis shape approximately 3 meters tall and 1 meter wide at its thickest point. But the ice wasn't natural, wasn't the cloudy, compressed result of snowfall and pressure. It was absolutely clear, like glass or diamond, and through that clarity, we could see the silhouette suspended inside, preserved with such perfect detail that I could make out individual fingers, could see the texture of what might have been clothing or might have been skin. The silhouette was humanoid, bilateral symmetry and recognizable anatomy, but the proportions were wrong in ways that made my hindbrain scream danger. Too tall, easily 9 feet if standing, with limbs that were too long, too thin, joints that suggested mobility in directions human bones don't accommodate. Dr. Chen approached the ice cocoon with the careful reverence of someone approaching a bomb or a religious relic, tablet forgotten in her hands. Scientific training warring with whatever emotional response was making her breath come in short gasps. Carbon dating on the wood gave us 2348 BCE, she said, voice barely audible, speaking more to herself than to us. That's 4,300 years of preservation, 4,300 years where this being has been suspended in ice that shouldn't remain frozen, breathing air that shouldn't remain breathable, waiting for... She reached out before I could stop her, pressing one palm flat against the ice surface, and I saw her expression transform from scientific curiosity to visceral terror in the space between heartbeats. It's warm, she gasped, yanking her hand back like she'd touched a stove. The ice is warm, not melting but warm, approximately body temperature, 98 degrees Fahrenheit. That's impossible. Ice can't maintain integrity at that temperature. It should be liquid, it should be... Colonel Patterson's voice cut through her analysis with command authority. All personnel, this is threshold actual. We are proceeding to specimen extraction. Dr. Chen, you will provide consultation but not interfere with military operations. Sergeant Holloway, your team is authorized to use force if the specimen demonstrates hostile behavior upon revival. Revival? He said revival like we were waking someone from a coma rather than potentially releasing something that had been sealed by God as a witness to humanity's near extinction. The extraction team moved in with equipment I didn't recognize. Industrial lasers mounted on tripods, positioning themselves around the ice cocoon with geometric precision. Chen grabbed my arm. Her earlier prayer-driven composure completely shattered. "We can't do this, Sergeant. You have to stop them. This is exactly what Rashid warned about. The inscription above the drill entry, I translated it during the last hour. It says, 'Sealed by covenant until the appointed time. Break not the seal, lest judgment return.' We're breaking the seal. We're violating a covenant made between this being and God himself, and we have no idea what we're releasing or why it was imprisoned here." But before I could respond, before I could even decide if I believed her interpretation or thought she was losing touch with reality under stress, the laser team activated their cutting beams. Focused, coherent light hit the ice cocoon from 4 directions simultaneously, and I expected it to start melting, to turn liquid and steam, and release whatever was inside through gradual thawing. Instead, the ice responded like it was alive, like it had been waiting for this exact stimulus. It didn't melt, but rather dissolved, matter transforming from solid to nothing without passing through any intermediate state, simply ceasing to exist wherever the lasers touched. The being inside didn't fall or stumble when the ice vanished beneath it, didn't show any sign of disorientation from 43 centuries of suspension. It simply stood there, perfectly balanced, as the last fragments of its crystalline prison evaporated into nothingness, and then its eyes opened. Then its eyes, not slowly, not with the gradual awareness of someone waking from sleep, but all at once, instantaneous transition from closed to open, and what I saw made every rational thought in my head evaporate, like that impossible ice. The eyes had no pupils, no irises, no whites, no human structure whatsoever. They were just light, pure white light that seemed to originate from somewhere behind the sockets, pouring out with an intensity that made me look away reflexively, even though it didn't hurt, even though it somehow didn't blind me. The being's skin was translucent, not transparent, but translucent, like frosted glass or thin porcelain, and beneath it I could see systems that resembled human anatomy, but weren't quite right. Vessels that glowed faintly with bioluminescence. Structures that might have been bones or might have been something else entirely, all working in perfect harmony that made our own biology look crude and unfinished by comparison. It wore something that might have been clothing, a simple robe-like garment that looked woven but reflected light in ways that fabric doesn't, and every movement it made was fluid, graceful, utterly inhuman in its precision. Then it spoke, and the sound wasn't voice in any conventional sense. It was vibration that bypassed my ears entirely and resonated directly in my skull, in my chest cavity, in the bones of my skeleton. "Behold, the witness awakens, and the covenant is broken." "Why have you called me back before the appointed hour?" The being moved before any of us could react, raising one impossibly long hand to press against the interior surface of the dissolving ice cocoon, and where its fingers made contact, the crystalline structure didn't crack or shatter. It simply ceased to exist, matter transforming into vapor or energy or nothing at all, with a sound like wind chimes played in reverse. Within seconds, the entire cocoon had vanished, leaving the being standing freely in the chamber's center. And that's when I got my first clear view of something that had been sealed away since the Bronze Age, something that biblical tradition might call an angel or a demon or a witness to divine judgment. It stood approximately 9 feet tall, proportions all wrong for human anatomy, limbs too elongated, joints that bent in subtle ways that suggested mobility beyond our skeletal limitations, fingers that were too long and too numerous, 7 digits on each hand instead of 5. The translucent skin wasn't merely pale, but actually see-through like thin alabaster, revealing beneath it a network of vessels that glowed with soft bioluminescence, blues and greens and golds pulsing in rhythms that might have been circulatory or might have been something else entirely, some biological process that our science didn't have vocabulary to describe. It wore a robe-like garment that appeared woven from threads too fine to distinguish individually, material that caught light impossibly, reflecting and refracting in patterns that hurt to look at directly, as if the fabric existed partially in dimensions my eyes couldn't fully perceive. The being stumbled slightly as it took its first steps in 4,000 years, catching itself with movements that were too fluid, too precise, lacking the awkwardness that should accompany muscles and nerves relearning coordination after millennia of suspension. Its feet, bare I noticed, with the same 7-digit structure as its hands, made no sound on the wooden floor despite clearly bearing weight, as if it existed slightly out of phase with physical matter, touching but not quite making full contact. Then it began turning slowly, deliberately, examining each human present with those pupilless eyes that poured forth white light. And I felt when that gaze fell on me like a physical pressure, like being scanned by technology more advanced than any X-ray or MRI, as if it was seeing not just my body but everything inside it, every thought and memory and secret I'd ever had. The hazmat specialist stumbled backward, one of them keying his radio with trembling hands. "Command, specimen is ambulatory. Repeat, specimen is moving. Requesting immediate extraction authorization and rules of engagement clarification." But Patterson's response was calm, almost excited. "Hold position. Do not engage unless directly threatened. We need documentation of specimen behavior and capabilities before containment." Documentation, like we were observing a zoo animal, rather than something that had been deliberately sealed as a witness to humanity's near extinction. The soldiers responded with training that overrode existential confusion. 5 rifles snapping up to aim at center mass. Red laser dots painting the being's torso in a cluster that indicated coordinated fire discipline, ready to dump 30 rounds into the target on my command. But the being showed no reaction to the weapons, didn't flinch or raise defensive posture, just continued its slow rotation until it had observed every human present, that luminous gaze lingering on Dr. Chen longer than the others, as if recognizing something in her that distinguished her from military personnel. Then, moving with deliberate slowness that communicated non-aggression more clearly than words could, the being lowered itself to its knees, not collapsing but controlled descent, knees bending backward in ways human joints don't accommodate, settling into a posture that I recognized immediately despite the alien anatomy, supplication, submission, the universal body language of peaceful intent. Its arms extended outward, palms up, those 7-fingered hands open and empty, and the gesture was so fundamentally, recognizably human despite the inhuman form that something in my chest clenched painfully. This wasn't a monster or a weapon or a specimen. This was someone, something sapient and aware, something that understood we were afraid and was trying desperately to communicate that it meant no harm. That's when I saw the tears, and that sight affected me more profoundly than anything else in this impossible situation. Crystalline drops forming in those glowing eyes, rolling down translucent cheeks, falling toward the floor but never reaching it because they froze mid-air, transforming into tiny perfect diamonds of ice that tinkled musically when they hit the wooden surface. The being was crying, genuinely crying with what looked like grief or relief or some emotion so complex I couldn't pass it, and the tears were freezing despite the chamber's above-zero temperature, creating a small constellation of crystallized sorrow on the floor before it. Dr. Chen broke formation, stepping forward before I could stop her, her scientific training apparently overriding self-preservation as she approached the kneeling figure with cautious reverence. She tried verbal communication first, cycling through languages with increasing desperation. "Do you understand me? Hebrew, Athim bin Avti, Aramaic, and mystical ent, Arabic, Hal tafhemni?" No response, not even acknowledgement that it heard her, though those luminous eyes tracked her movements with clear intelligence. She tried ancient languages that existed only in academic texts: Akkadian, Sumerian, Proto-Canaanite, reconstructed pronunciations of dead tongues that hadn't been spoken in 3,000 years. Still nothing, just that kneeling posture of peace and those frozen tears accumulating like diamonds on the floor. Then the being moved again, slowly raising one 7-fingered hand to point at its own forehead, holding the gesture for several seconds to ensure we understood it was deliberate communication, not random movement. The hand moved, still slowly, still telegraphing intent, to point at Dr. Chen's forehead, then swept to indicate each human present, pausing longest when it pointed at me. The meaning was clear even without words. It wanted to touch our foreheads, wanted some kind of contact that its inability to speak made necessary. "Absolutely not," Patterson's voice crackled through comms, having watched everything via body cameras we were required to wear. "No physical contact with the specimen until we've completed biological assessment. Dr. Chen, step back immediately. That's a direct order." But Chen had that look in her eyes that I'd seen in combat medics who'd decided saving a life mattered more than following protocols. That expression that said she was about to do something insubordinate because her conscience demanded it. "Colonel," she said, voice steady despite the impossible situation. "This being has been sealed in this chamber for over 4,000 years as a deliberate act of preservation. If it wanted to harm us, it could have done so already. It's attempting communication through the only means available when verbal language fails. I recommend..." Patterson cut her off. "Recommendation noted and denied. Sergeant Holloway, remove Dr. Chen from the chamber and prepare for specimen containment procedures." I hesitated, caught between military discipline that had been drilled into me for 12 years and the growing certainty that Dr. Chen was right, that this being wasn't a threat, but a witness trying desperately to deliver a message that had been waiting 4 millennia to be heard. The being seemed to sense my internal conflict, turning those glowing eyes directly toward me with an intensity that made my breath catch, and in that moment, I felt something I'd never experienced before. Not telepathy exactly, not words in my mind, but an overwhelming impression of urgency combined with profound sadness, like standing next to someone who was watching their world end and couldn't make anyone understand the danger. It raised both hands slowly, deliberately, pointing first to its own forehead, then to mine with unmistakable specificity. Not Chen, not any of the other soldiers, but me specifically, for reasons I couldn't fathom. The frozen tears continued falling, accumulating, creating a sound like wind chimes as they struck the floor, and I realized this being had been waiting in that ice prison for 43 centuries to deliver a message, sealed away by covenant until the appointed time, and we'd broken that seal prematurely, woken it before it was ready, before humanity was ready. But it was trying anyway, reaching across an impossible gulf of time and biology and experience to communicate something it considered desperately important. "Sergeant Holloway, that is a direct order. Remove Dr. Chen and prepare for..." I reached up and switched off my body camera, heard 3 other soldiers do the same in violation of protocols that would probably end all our careers. "Sir, we're experiencing technical difficulties with body camera systems," I lied into the comms. "Possible electromagnetic interference from the specimen, attempting to resolve." Then I stepped forward, moving past Dr. Chen, approaching the kneeling being with my rifle lowered but not holstered, compromising between caution and trust in a way that felt simultaneously stupid and absolutely necessary. Up close, I could see details that distance had obscured. The way its skin wasn't just translucent but seemed to shift slightly, like watching oil on water, never quite solid in appearance. The fact that it didn't appear to be breathing, chest never rising or falling despite clear signs of biological function, symbols carved or tattooed or somehow embedded into its flesh, writing that matched the inscriptions on the chamber walls, covering its arms and neck and disappearing beneath the robe. It smelled like ozone and honey and something else, something that reminded me of churches or libraries or other spaces that held old important things. "If you're going to kill me," I said quietly, knowing it probably couldn't understand English but needing to speak anyway, "make it quick. But if you're really here to show me something, to be a witness like that inscription said, then I'm ready. Show me what was worth preserving for 4,000 years. The being's hand moved with sudden speed that should have triggered my combat reflexes, but instead felt inevitable, inescapable, like watching lightning strike and knowing you were always going to be in its path. 7 fingers pressed against my forehead with surprising gentleness, and the touch was cold. Not ice cold, but the cold of deep space, of absolute zero, of temperatures that shouldn't exist in contact with living flesh. Pain exploded through my skull. Not physical pain, but something deeper, like having my consciousness forcibly expanded beyond the boundaries of my brain, like being turned inside out on a level that had nothing to do with flesh and everything to do with whatever part of me existed beyond meat and neurons. I tried to scream but had no mouth, tried to pull away but had no body, tried to think coherent thoughts but had no language because language was dissolving, meaning fragmenting into pure experience without the structure of words to contain it. Dr. Chen was shouting something, soldiers moving to intervene, but they were so far away, so impossibly distant despite being inches from my collapsing body, because I wasn't in the chamber anymore, wasn't on the mountain, wasn't on Earth. I was standing in an infinite field of green grass that moved in waves without wind, under a sky that held 2 moons, one silver, one violet, hanging impossibly large and close. their surfaces visible in detail that should require telescopes, close enough to see continents and oceans on worlds that orbited different stars. The grass beneath my feet wasn't grass, not really. Each blade was crystalline, transparent, refracting light into rainbows that painted the ground in colors I had no names for, colors that existed outside the spectrum human eyes were designed to perceive. The temperature was perfect, exactly the warmth you'd choose if you could dial in comfort with infinite precision, and the air tasted like memory, like nostalgia for places I'd never been and times I'd never lived. Silence surrounded me, absolute and complete. No wind or bird song or distant machinery, just pure stillness that somehow wasn't oppressive but peaceful, like the universe was holding its breath. Then a voice spoke, except it wasn't a voice because I had no ears to hear with. No acoustic waves vibrating tympanic membranes. It was meaning appearing directly in my consciousness, bypassing all sensory systems and implanting itself fully formed into my understanding. Behold, son of Adam, witness what was before the waters came and mankind forgot their true history. See the world as it existed when the Watchers descended to observe creation, when humanity lived 900 years and spoke one language beneath a different sky. See, before you forget again, before the truth is buried beneath millennia of mythology and the witness sleeps once more. I wasn't watching the memory like a film projected in my mind. I was living it, experiencing it from inside a consciousness that wasn't mine, seeing through eyes that processed light in spectrums human vision couldn't capture, thinking thoughts in patterns that human neurology wasn't structured to accommodate. I was Azariel, and that name meant something profound in a language that predated all human tongues, translated roughly as whom God has helped, but carrying connotations of duty and witness and eternal service that English couldn't fully express. The year, if such measurements had meaning in a world where humans routinely lived 8 or 9 centuries, was approximately 3000 BCE by the calendar that wouldn't be invented for millennia. Though Azariel's perception of time was non-linear, experiencing past and present and near future simultaneously in ways that would have shattered human consciousness but felt natural to this being I had temporarily become. Azariel stood, on a hillside overlooking a city that shouldn't exist according to every archaeological timeline I'd ever studied. A metropolis of white stone towers rising hundreds of feet into air that was clearer than any atmosphere I'd known, unpolluted by the industrial residue that would define later ages. The architecture was impossible. Massive blocks fitted with tolerances that modern engineering struggled to match, arranged in geometric patterns that somehow resonated with natural harmonics, creating structures that sang softly in wind currents, producing tones that promoted healing and clarity of thought in ways that were half science, half art, and entirely beyond my comprehension. The technology wasn't electronic. There were no wires, no circuits, no computers or machines in any form I recognized, but rather something based on crystalline resonance, on understanding how specific geometric arrangements of mineral structures could capture, store, and redirect natural forces that humans of my era had forgotten even existed. I saw through Azariel's eyes as citizens moved through streets lit by crystals that absorbed sunlight during the day and released it gradually through the night, never requiring fuel or maintenance, simply working in perpetual harmony with natural cycles. Transportation involved platforms that somehow negated gravitational influence through principles I couldn't grasp, allowing massive stone blocks to float as easily as leaves on water, guided by operators who understood resonance frequencies the way future generations would understand computer code. The people themselves looked human but healthier, more vital, with none of the degenerative conditions that plagued later eras. Men and women who had lived 5, 6, even 800 years and showed no signs of the aging that modern humans experienced after mere decades. Their faces held wisdom accumulated across centuries, eyes that had witnessed the rise and fall of dynasties that existed so far back in history that my own era would know them only as myths, if at all. Children played in streets paved with stones that absorbed impact, preventing injury, while elders sat in gardens where plants grew in patterns that promoted medicinal effects, botanical engineering that wouldn't be rediscovered until pharmaceutical companies of the 20th century stumbled upon synthetic approximations. But underneath the beauty, permeating everything like rot beneath fresh paint, was corruption so profound that Azariel's consciousness recoiled from it, even as I experienced it through his senses. The Nephilim ruled here, and that word carried weight in Azariel's mind, translated as giants or fallen ones, depending on which ancient text you consulted. But the reality was more horrifying than either translation suggested. They were hybrids, biological impossibilities born from unions that violated divine law. Watchers who had descended to observe humanity had instead taken human women as wives, mixing angelic and human genetics in ways that produced offspring who inherited superhuman strength and longevity from their fathers, but human appetites and ambitions from their mothers, creating beings who had godlike power but human-scale vices amplified to monstrous proportions. They stood 14, 15 feet tall, with proportions that were almost human but distorted. Too much muscle mass for their skeletal structure. Faces that would have been handsome except for the wrongness in the angles. Eyes that reflected light like animals, because they weren't fully human behind those eyes anymore. Azariel watched, and I watched through him, as a Nephilim warrior casually backhanded a human merchant who had failed to pay tribute, the blow sending the man flying 30 feet to crash against a wall with force that shattered bones. And nobody intervened because intervention meant death, because the giants had made it clear through centuries of examples that humans were livestock, resources to be exploited until used up and then replaced. I felt Azariel's anguish as he moved through the city, documenting atrocities he was forbidden to prevent, because watchers were observers, not interveners, bound by laws that predated creation itself to witness and record, but never to directly alter human affairs. He documented the slave markets where humans were bought and sold like animals, saw women forced into breeding programs designed to produce more Nephilim hybrids, watched children barely old enough to walk being taken from parents who would never see them again, their fates sealed in pleasure houses or fighting pits where the giants entertained themselves with human suffering. The worst part, the thing that made Azariel's usually calm consciousness scream with frustrated rage, was that some humans participated willingly in their own degradation, corrupted by promises of power or longevity, or simply by the normalization of horror, becoming collaborators who helped the Nephilim identify resistors, who ran the slave markets, who tortured their own species for favor from the giants. Azariel had witnessed 300 years of this degradation, watched as a civilization that had once touched the divine fell into depravity so complete that violence had become entertainment, that cannibalism, the Nephilim consuming human flesh in public feasts, was not only accepted but celebrated. He and other faithful watchers had pleaded with the rebel angels who had sired the Nephilim, begged them to see that they were destroying the very creation they had been sent to observe, but the rebels had long since abandoned any pretense of divine obedience, drunk on worship from humans who had forgotten or forsaken the true Creator in favor of beings they could see and touch and fear. Then came the summons, not spoken but impressed directly into Azariel's consciousness with force that made even his inhuman nervous system convulse. The wickedness of man is great upon the earth, and every imagination of the thoughts of his heart is only evil continually. It repents me that I made them, and I will destroy man whom I created from the face of the earth, both man and beast and creeping things and fowls of the air. For it repents me that I made them. The words were judgment, were sentence, were the decision of a creator who had watched his creation corrupt itself beyond redemption and had decided to start over, with only the genetic stock that remained pure, uncontaminated by Nephilim bloodlines. But then came the exception, the single thread of mercy woven through apocalyptic judgment. Find the righteous one. He alone have I seen as just in this generation. Warn him, instruct him. One family shall be preserved as seed for the new creation. Azariel felt the weight of that mission crash down upon his consciousness, the terrible responsibility of choosing which bloodline would survive while all others drowned, of becoming the instrument through which God's mercy would operate in the midst of his wrath. He received coordinates, not in terms of latitude and longitude which hadn't been invented yet, but as a sort of spiritual GPS that pulled at his consciousness, directing him toward one specific human among the millions who would soon be erased from existence. The journey took weeks, covering distances that would span multiple modern countries, moving from the corrupt cities of the Nephilim-controlled territories into borderlands where humans still lived in relative freedom, having retreated from metropolitan centers to avoid the giants' predation. Azariel traveled invisibly most of the time, his form existing slightly out of phase with normal matter, visible only when he chose to be, or when interacting with physical objects required it. He passed through villages where people still worshipped the Creator, where altars of unhewn stone stood in contrast to the elaborate temples the Nephilim had built to celebrate themselves, where families taught their children the old stories of creation and covenant that were being forgotten in the cities. And finally, in a valley near what would one day be called Mesopotamia, but was then simply the land between the rivers, he found him, Noah, 520 years old by Azariel's calculation, looking like a man in his 30s by modern standards, because antediluvian physiology aged so slowly, living in a stone house with his wife and 3 sons, supporting himself through agriculture and craft work. What distinguished Noah wasn't appearance. He looked like any other human of his era, but rather the spiritual resonance that Azariel's senses detected, a sort of divine frequency that marked this man as fundamentally different from the corrupted masses, uncontaminated by Nephilim genetics, still maintaining covenant with a creator most had forgotten. Azariel approached while Noah was constructing an altar, stacking unhewn stones according to divine specifications that prohibited tool marks or human enhancement, building a place of sacrifice with his own hands despite being wealthy enough to hire laborers. The man worked with quiet devotion, placing each stone with care, speaking prayers under his breath in the original language, the one tongue that all humans still shared before Babel would fracture it into thousands of dialects. Azariel materialized slowly, allowing his form to phase gradually into visibility so as not to terrify the human, though even gentle manifestation caused Noah to stumble backward, dropping the stone he'd been placing, falling to his knees in posture of worship or terror or both. "Do not fear," Azariel said, his voice carefully modulated to produce actual acoustic waves rather than the telepathic communication he used with other watchers, speaking the original human language that Noah would understand. "I am Azariel, Watcher of the Most High, sent as messenger to you, Noah son of Lamech, grandson of Methuselah who yet lives. I bring warning and instruction from the Creator, whose covenant you alone have maintained while the earth has filled with violence." Noah remained kneeling, face pressed to the ground, trembling visibly, and Azariel felt the familiar frustration of angelic beings trying to communicate with humans. The physical form he wore was necessary to interact in material reality, but terrifying to human perception, inevitable when something not entirely natural attempted to operate within natural laws. "Rise, Noah," Azariel commanded gently. "The Lord has seen your righteousness in this generation, has observed that you alone walk blameless before him, while others corrupt their way. He has decided to destroy all flesh, for the earth is filled with violence through the Nephilim and those who serve them. The wickedness of man is great, and every imagination of his heart is only evil continually." Noah stood slowly, meeting Azariel's glowing eyes with expression that mixed terror and awe in equal measure, and asked the question that humans always asked when confronted with divine judgment. "What must I do, messenger of the Most High? How can one man stand against the corruption of millions?" Azariel extended one 7-fingered hand, placing it on Noah's shoulder in gesture of reassurance that made the human flinch slightly, still adjusting to the reality of angelic contact. "The Lord has given me instruction for you. He will send waters upon the earth, waters from above and below, to cleanse the corruption and erase the Nephilim bloodlines that have polluted his creation. But you and your house shall be saved, preserved as seed for the new world that will emerge when the waters recede." Noah's face showed confusion more than fear now, intellectual struggle to comprehend what was being described. "Waters from above?" he repeated slowly. "You mean rain?" The word existed in his language, but only theoretically, describing something that occurred in distant lands, but never here, never in the stable climate that humanity had known for centuries. "My Lord told me this also," Noah said quietly, voice carrying the wonder of someone confirming a message they'd half believed was internal delusion. "He spoke to me in dreams, said that he would send rain, though I confess I do not fully understand what rain is, having never witnessed it, and that I must build a vessel to float upon the waters that will cover the earth." He looked at Azariel with eyes that held 5 centuries of accumulated wisdom, but also the vulnerability of someone being asked to bet everything on instructions that made no logical sense. But Lord Azariel, I must ask, what is rain? How can waters fall from above when everyone knows that water falls to the lowest place, that it runs downhill and gathers in valleys? How can it come from the sky? And in that question, I heard something profound about the antediluvian world. They had never seen rain, had lived under atmospheric conditions so stable that precipitation as I understood it simply didn't occur, with the earth watered by morning mists and underground springs exactly as Genesis 2:6 described, before the flood permanently altered planetary climate systems. Azariel smiled. I felt his face muscles move in ways that approximated human expression of reassurance, and began explaining what would come, what Noah must build to survive it, dimensions and specifications that God had provided in dreams but that Azariel would now clarify and assist with in the limited ways his covenant allowed. Come, the Watcher said, gesturing toward the unfinished altar. Let us complete this place of sacrifice together, and I will tell you of the vessel you must build, of the gathering that will come, of the judgment and mercy that approach like storm clouds, gathering on a horizon you cannot yet see. You ask what rain is, Noah, son of Lamech? Before the year turns 5 more times, you and all the earth will know. The memory shifted, time compressing in ways that human consciousness couldn't naturally experience. 100 years passing like pages turning in a book. Each moment crystal clear but sequential understanding maintained through Azariel's non-linear perception of temporal flow. I watched through his eyes as Noah began the work, starting with timber selection in forests that would be reduced to legend by the time archaeologists of my era debated which trees might have existed in the ancient Near East. God had specified gopher wood in his instructions, though the word was really kofa, resinous wood, wood that would resist rot and insect damage across centuries if necessary, wood that contained natural preservatives in its cellular structure. Azariel couldn't directly tell Noah which trees to cut. That would violate the covenant that bound watchers to observation rather than intervention, but he could arrange for Noah's path through the forest to take him past specific groves, could cause a branch to fall here, or a bird to call there, gentle nudges that led the human to discover Cupressus sempervirens, the Mediterranean cypress that grew in a particular valley where soil conditions produced timber with optimal density and resin content. Noah would later tell his sons that God had shown him which trees to harvest, and that was true in the sense that all providence ultimately originated from divine will, but Azariel had been the instrument through which that showing occurred, walking the edge between forbidden intervention and permitted guidance with precision that required constant vigilance. The construction began in a valley that Noah owned, land inherited from his father Lamech, who had died just as the work commenced, leaving Noah with wealth enough to purchase additional acreage and hire laborers who would quit within weeks once they understood the scope of the insane project. The dimensions God had provided were specific: 300 cubits long, 50 cubits wide, 30 cubits high, using the royal Egyptian cubit of 26 inches that was standard measurement in that era, producing a vessel 515 feet long, 86 feet wide, 51.5 feet tall, proportions that Azariel's mathematical mind recognized as hydrodynamically optimal for stability in heavy seas, a length-to-width ratio of 6.1 that modern naval architecture would later determine was perfect for ships meant to survive storms rather than achieve speed. But Noah didn't know hydrodynamics, didn't have engineering training or naval architecture expertise, possessed nothing except faith in instructions that seemed designed to bankrupt him and make him a laughingstock. Azariel watched as the man marked out the dimensions using rope and stakes, creating an outline on bare earth that looked impossibly large, longer than any structure in the region except the Nephilim palaces, wider than most humans would travel in a lifetime. When Noah's son, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, all over 100 years old themselves but still considered young by antediluvian standard, first saw the marked outline, Shem had fallen to his knees and wept, convinced his father had lost his mind, while Ham had argued loudly that this folly would consume their entire inheritance and leave them destitute. But Noah began anyway, rising before dawn each morning to work while most of the valley still slept, cutting timber and trimming logs and assembling the skeletal framework that would eventually become humanity's salvation. Azariel remained invisible most days, watching from positions that gave clear lines of sight, documenting everything in the way watchers documented, not with written records but with perfect memory, every detail preserved in consciousness that didn't forget, that would retain this moment with complete fidelity for millennia. He saw Noah make mistakes, saw the human waste weeks on a joint design that wouldn't bear the necessary weight, saw him pray desperately for guidance, and then dream solutions that came from divine inspiration, but which Azariel helped implement by appearing at critical moments to point out load-bearing principles, to demonstrate through subtle example how ancient builders had solved similar problems, walking that razor-thin line between forbidden intervention and permitted education. The angles of the hull proved particularly challenging. Noah understood that the vessel needed to be stable, needed to ride waves rather than fight them, but calculating the precise curve that would allow a ship this size to self-right after rolling in heavy seas required mathematics that wouldn't be formalized for thousands of years. Azariel solved this through demonstration, building small-scale models during nights when Noah slept, leaving them where the builder would find them in morning light, perfect miniature representations showing how hull curves should progress from keel to gunwale, and Noah would study these models with the intensity of a man who knew his family's survival depended on replicating the design at full scale. The ridicule began almost immediately and intensified with each passing year until it became a sort of regional entertainment, a daily ritual where neighbors and travelers would detour through Noah's Valley, specifically to mock the growing skeleton of impossible wood that served no purpose anyone could fathom. I felt through Azariel's perception the waves of scorn that washed over Noah every single day for 100 years. Vendors in the marketplace refusing to sell him supplies because they considered him cursed or insane. Children throwing stones and rotting vegetables while their parents laughed. Respected elders who had once sought Noah's counsel now crossing the street to avoid acknowledging his existence. The mockery had a particular cruelty that came from watching someone waste their life on delusion. "Noah the boat builder," they would shout, laughing until tears ran down their faces. "Noah, who prepares for water from the sky. Noah, who thinks God speaks to him while the rest of us live in reality." Worse than strangers' contempt was the doubt from those closest. Shem, the eldest son, remaining loyal but clearly struggling with faith, working alongside his father but flinching visibly whenever neighbors mocked them. Ham grew bitter, working with increasing resentment, complaining loudly that his father's obsession was ruining their family's reputation and marriage prospects, that no woman of good family would accept betrothal to sons of the madman building a boat in the desert. And Japheth, the youngest, vacillated between commitment and despair, some days working with enthusiasm and others disappearing for weeks, unable to face the shame. Noah's wife, her name wasn't recorded in the texts I'd read, but Azariel knew her as Naamah, daughter of Lamech's brother, a woman who had married Noah when both were barely past their first century, suffered in ways that made Azariel's compassionate consciousness ache with vicarious pain. She had been a woman of standing in the community, respected for wisdom accumulated across 200 years, sought out for counsel by younger wives navigating their own marriages. But as the ark grew, as Noah's obsession consumed their wealth and reputation, she found herself isolated, scorned by women who had once been friends, whispered about in markets as the mad builder's wife, with pity that hurt worse than open mockery. Azariel documented the nights when she cried, kneeling in their bedchamber after Noah had fallen asleep exhausted from 16-hour workdays, praying desperately for understanding or release. "Lord, if you have truly called my husband to this work, grant me strength to endure the shame. If he labors under delusion, release him from this burden before it destroys our sons' futures entirely." But each morning she rose and prepared food, carried water, maintained their household while her husband built his impossible boat, choosing loyalty over dignity because whatever else Noah was, he had never lied to her across 3 centuries of marriage, had never broken covenant or abandoned principle even when doing so would have been easier. That faithfulness, that history of integrity, purchased her continued support, even as her heart broke daily. But through Azariel's memory, I experienced what the mockers couldn't see, what even Noah's family only glimpsed in moments, the absolute certainty that sustained the builder through 100 years of ridicule, the faith that wasn't blind, but rather grounded in relationship, in personal history, with a God who had never once failed to keep his word. Noah didn't believe in rain because logic suggested it. Rain was illogical, impossible, contrary to every observation of how the world worked. He believed because God had said it would rain, and God had previously said the sun would rise and it rose, had said crops would grow and they grew, had said Nama would conceive despite decades of barrenness, and she had borne 3 sons exactly as promised. Faith, I realized through Azariel's understanding, wasn't about believing impossible things. It was about trusting a person whose track record had established absolute reliability, about taking someone at their word when their word had never proven false. Every morning when Noah picked up his tools, he wasn't defying logic. He was honoring relationship, choosing to trust a covenant partner who had specified consequences. Build this vessel to these dimensions in this location, and when the waters come, your family will live. The simplicity of it was almost overwhelming. No complex theology, no philosophical justification, just transactional faith. You said, I believe, I obey. That bedrock certainty radiated from Noah like heat from fire, palpable to Azariel's senses even when invisible to human perception, and it was that quality, that unshakable trust, despite absolute lack of physical evidence, that had marked Noah as righteous in a generation where everyone else had made themselves the measure of truth. The ark took shape slowly, grain by grain of human effort across decades that would have broken lesser men, growing from skeletal frame to planked hull to sealed vessel with 3 interior decks, rooms for animals and supplies, a window at the top and a door in the side, exactly as God had specified. Azariel watched Noah master techniques that shouldn't exist in his era, advanced joinery that distributed stress across multiple connection points, waterproofing using bitumen mixed with aromatic resins that prevented microbial degradation, ventilation systems that would allow air circulation for hundreds of enclosed animals without modern fans or pumps. Sometimes Noah discovered these solutions through trial and error, building and rebuilding sections until they worked. Other times he dreamed them, waking with detailed understanding of problems he'd never studied. And occasionally Azariel bent the rules of non-interference to their breaking point, appearing in physical form to demonstrate a principle or correct a critical error, always framing his help as suggestion rather than instruction. Some ancient builders use this joint for heavy loads, or I have seen ships in distant lands that survive storms using this hull configuration. Noah never questioned why an angelic being would have knowledge of ship construction, accepting help gratefully while maintaining clear understanding that the design ultimately came from God, that Azariel was messenger and helper, but not architect. The Watcher documented everything, every technique, every dimension, every innovation that Noah implemented through divine inspiration, filtered through human ingenuity, creating a record that would survive millennia sealed in ice, preserved as testimony to what humanity could achieve when acting in covenant with their Creator. Then came the morning, 100 years and 17 days after construction began by Azariel's precise count, when the first animals arrived. Noah was working on final waterproofing, spreading hot bitumen across joints in the hull's exterior, when Shem shouted from the valley entrance, voice carrying a quality that made everyone stop working immediately. Not alarm, exactly, but profound confusion, mixed with something approaching awe. Azariel moved to observe, his form invisible, and saw what had made Shem call out. Animals were coming, walking up the valley road in pairs, male and female, moving with purpose that was completely contrary to their natural behavior. Lions padded alongside gazelles without the predators showing any hunting interest, their eternal enmity somehow suspended by force greater than instinct. Wolves walked peaceably next to sheep, bears ambled alongside deer, raptors soared overhead in formation, while prey birds flew among them without fear. They came from every direction, converging on the ark as if following invisible summons, and they weren't just local species. Azariel's comprehensive knowledge of zoology recognized animals from regions hundreds of miles distant, creatures that had no business being in this valley, that must have traveled for weeks or months, guided by programming that overrode territorial behavior and survival instincts. Noah fell to his knees in the mud, bitumen forgotten, hands raised toward heaven, and he wept with the abandon of someone whose faith has been suddenly, overwhelmingly vindicated after a century of doubt from everyone around him. God, Noah prayed through tears, voice breaking with emotion accumulated across 100 years of scorn. God, forgive them. Forgive my neighbors who mocked, my family who doubted, every person who called me mad. They do not see what you have shown me, do not understand what approaches. When the waters come, his voice cracked completely, forcing him to pause and gather himself. When the waters come, Remember that they rejected you from ignorance, not malice. They have forgotten your covenant, forgotten that you are real and active and keep your promises. But I remember. I have remembered through 100 years of shame, and now you show me that remembering was enough. The animals continued arriving through the day and into the night, filling yards and pens that Noah had built, without fully understanding why they needed to be so large, so numerous, organized according to categories that showed they represented all kinds, all families, all species that breathed air and walked on land. Azariel watched Noah's family move among the animals in wonder, touching creatures they'd only heard about in travelers' tales, seeing with their own eyes the vindication of faith they'd supported with increasing doubt. Nama knelt beside her husband, pressing her face against his shoulder, and whispered words that Azariel's enhanced hearing captured. "I'm sorry I doubted. I'm sorry I cried and questioned. You were right all along." Noah held her tightly, both of them weeping now, and responded, "You never doubted me, beloved. You doubted the situation, doubted your understanding, but you stayed. That's all faith really requires, staying when leaving would be easier." Then the sky began to change, and that change was so gradual that humans barely noticed at first. But Azariel's senses detected the atmospheric shift immediately, pressure dropping, moisture content rising, thermal patterns that had remained stable for centuries suddenly destabilizing, as if the very firmament that separated waters above from waters below was beginning to fail. Clouds appeared, not the thin wisps that occasionally drifted at high altitudes, but massive formations that built with supernatural speed, darkening from white to gray to black in hours rather than days, blocking the sun until the valley fell into premature twilight. Thunder rolled across the sky, a sound most humans had never heard before, interpreted by many as the voice of angry gods, while lightning carved brightness through darkness in patterns that looked almost deliberate, almost like writing in fire. And then, exactly as God had promised, exactly as Noah had proclaimed for 100 years to audiences who laughed and mocked and called him insane, it began to rain. The first drop struck Azariel's forehead as he stood invisible beside the ark, watching history pivot on this moment, and he felt it with all the sensory acuity of angelic perception. Liquid water falling from the sky, impossible by all natural law as humans understood it, occurring anyway because the God who had established natural law was also capable of transcending it. More drops followed, slowly at first, individual impacts that humans could count and wonder at, then faster still, until the air itself seemed to transform into water, until rain fell with force that had never existed before and would never exist again with quite this supernatural intensity. The heavens opening not metaphorically but literally, as the firmament that had held waters above the earth for millennia finally gave way under divine command, and the flood, the event that would define human history, that would separate all of time into before and after, began. The memory fractured, becoming chaotic and non-linear as Azariel's usually perfect consciousness struggled to process events so catastrophic that even angelic perception couldn't maintain complete coherence, couldn't impose order on destruction that unmade the entire world in 40 days and 40 nights of violence, that redefined what water could do to earth and flesh. Through his overwhelmed senses, I experienced the rain not as gentle precipitation, but as artillery bombardment, each drop hitting with force that stung exposed skin, that accumulated into streams within minutes and rivers within hours. Water falling so densely that breathing became difficult because the air itself was more liquid than gas, because inhaling meant drowning a little with every breath. The sound was deafening, overwhelming, a roar that made communication impossible and thought nearly so. Billions of impacts per second, creating white noise that vibrated in chest cavities and skull bones, that made teeth ache and hearts stutter with the relentless percussion of apocalypse. Trees that had stood for centuries, massive cypresses and cedars with root systems that had survived droughts and winds, were uprooted within hours as soil liquefied under the deluge, their ancient trunks torn from the earth like weeds pulled from a garden, crashing down in cascades that killed anyone unfortunate enough to be beneath them. I felt Azariel's anguish as he watched from his position near the ark, watching humans who had moments before been mocking Noah suddenly realize their error, scrambling toward the vessel that represented their only salvation, pounding on its sealed door while rain battered them. while water already ankle-deep around the ark's foundation rose with terrifying speed. But the rain was only the beginning, only the visible manifestation of judgment, because God had specified the fountains of the great deep would also break open. And I experienced through Azariel's geological awareness what that meant. Tectonic catastrophe on a scale that modern plate tectonics couldn't explain. The entire crust of the planet simultaneously fracturing as underground aquifers that had accumulated for millennia suddenly burst forth under pressure that had been building since creation. Earthquakes struck everywhere at once. Not isolated tremors, but global convulsion. Magnitude 9 and 10 events occurring simultaneously across every continent, shattering rock formations that had stood since the Earth cooled from molten chaos. And from those fractures came water, superheated water from reservoirs deep in the crust, water that had been trapped under pressure for eons, water mixed with minerals and gases that made it toxic and caustic, exploding upward in geysers hundreds of feet tall, adding to the deluge from above, until it seemed water was trying to reclaim the entire planet, to return creation to the formless void described in Genesis, before God had separated the waters. Through Azariel's senses I perceived the mechanism, a planetary water cycle vastly different from what I knew in the 21st century, a system where water above the firmament and water below the earth were held in delicate balance, and God had simply released both simultaneously, letting them meet in the middle where humanity lived and breathed and sinned. Cities that had stood for centuries vanished in minutes, not gradually flooded but catastrophically engulfed as fissures opened beneath them and water erupted from below while rain hammered from above, stone towers crumbling like sandcastles, populations of thousands swept away before they could even scream, their voices silenced by the roar of judgment. The Nephilim, those giant hybrid abominations who had ruled as tyrants, who had considered themselves gods incarnate, untouchable and eternal, discovered in their final hours that size and strength meant nothing against water that had no mercy and no fear. Azariel watched them flee the cities, their superhuman speed allowing them to outrun the initial floods, heading for mountains where altitude might provide safety from rising waters. He saw one giant, 15 feet tall and proportionately massive, carrying his human wife and 3 hybrid children, running with ground-eating strides toward high ground, actually making progress until a fissure opened directly beneath him and superheated water erupted upward, scalding flesh from bones in seconds. The giant's scream cut off almost instantly as he fell into the pit that had swallowed him. Others made it farther, reaching foothills and then slopes, climbing with desperate strength, looking back to see the valley they'd ruled completely submerged, watching water rise with impossible speed as if the entire planet was being filled like a bathtub. Some climbed for days, staying ahead of the rising flood, reaching peaks they thought were high enough, only to watch water continue rising, continue climbing, eliminating altitude advantage hour by hour. I felt Azariel's conflicted emotions as he observed their deaths. These beings were corruption personified, genetic violations that never should have existed, yet they had consciousness and families and the capacity to feel terror, and watching them drown was still agony for a being created to value all life. The last Nephilim Azariel witnessed died on a mountain peak, clutching his young son, water already at his chest, screaming curses at the sky until water filled his mouth and lungs and silenced him forever, his son's smaller body floating briefly before sinking beneath waves that churned with the violence of supernatural judgment. But worse than the Nephilim deaths were the humans, millions of humans who had been corrupted or enslaved or simply complicit, who had participated in or ignored atrocities, but who were still fundamentally human, still made in the image of a god who was now erasing them from existence. Azariel's perfect memory captured moments I wished I hadn't experienced. A mother holding her infant above water, standing on tiptoes as the flood rose past her chin, past her mouth, past her nose, holding that baby aloft until her own lungs gave out, and she drowned while the child she'd saved lived perhaps 30 seconds longer before waves tore it from her dead fingers. A group of children, maybe 20 of them, all under 10 years old, who had somehow survived the initial catastrophe, clinging to a floating mass of debris, singing songs their parents had taught them to ward off fear, their young voices carrying across the water until one by one exhaustion or cold claimed them, and they slipped beneath the surface, the last child singing alone until his voice simply stopped. An old man, easily 800 years old, who had lived through the entire corruption of his civilization, who perhaps remembered when Nephilim first appeared and humans first began forgetting their creator, floating on a log, praying desperately for forgiveness, reciting covenants he'd learned in childhood but hadn't honored in centuries, begging God for mercy until his strength failed, and the log rolled and his ancient lungs filled with the water that was purging his sin along with his life. Through Azariel, I experienced each death not as statistic, but as individual tragedy, each one a consciousness that would never exist again, a unique combination of genetics and experience and potential that was being permanently erased. And I understood with devastating clarity what the flood really was. Not a story about a boat and animals, but the most horrific act of mercy in history, a cosmic reset button pushed because the cancer of corruption had metastasized so completely that the only cure was to kill the patient and start over with the single healthy cell that remained. Inside the ark, sealed by divine command just before the rain began, its massive door swinging closed with finality that meant there would be no last-minute rescues, no exceptions, no mercy beyond what had already been extended. Chaos reigned, despite Noah's preparation. Animals that had walked peacefully into their pens now panicked as the structure lurched and groaned under forces it was never designed to withstand, as waves began forming that tossed a vessel 500 feet long like a toy boat in a bathtub. Azariel had accompanied the family inside, his form invisible but his presence a comfort to Noah even if the man couldn't articulate why he felt less afraid than he should. The sounds were hellish, animals screaming in terror, wood creaking under stress that should have torn the structure apart, water hammering against the hull with force that sent vibrations through every timber, and through it all the roar of rain and wind and tectonic destruction that penetrated even the ark's thick walls. Noah's family vomited from motion sickness as the vessel pitched and rolled, experiencing forces their inner ears had never encountered, their bodies rebelling against movement that confirmed they were adrift on an ocean that shouldn't exist, that was drowning a world they'd known for centuries. Ham cursed between retching, shouting that they were going to die, that the ark would break apart, that this salvation was just slower death than drowning would have been. Naamah held her daughters-in-law, all three women crying, praying, sometimes screaming when particularly violent motion threw them against walls despite their attempts to brace themselves. Shem and Japheth worked frantically to secure cargo that had broken loose, to calm animals that were injuring themselves in panic, to bail water that leaked through joints that were 99% waterproof, but not 100%, that let in enough moisture to make everyone terrifyingly aware that their survival depended on seals holding against forces Noah's engineering had never been tested against. But through all of it, through 40 days and 40 nights of chaos that would have broken most men's sanity, Noah sang. Azariel documented this with particular attention because it exemplified everything that had marked Noah as righteous. The man sang psalms, hymns of praise to a God who was currently drowning the world, songs of thanksgiving in the midst of terror, worship despite circumstances that seemed to contradict everything except the immediate fact of survival. His voice was steady when everyone else's wavered, calm when others panicked, maintaining melody and rhythm while the ark pitched through waves that must have been hundreds of feet tall, while thunder and earthquake and wind screamed accompaniment. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," he sang. Words that wouldn't be written down by David for another 1,000 years, but which existed in oral tradition, in the covenantal language humans used when addressing their Creator. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me." And somehow, impossibly, his faith stabilized everyone else, gave them a center to hold onto when physical stability was impossible, reminded them that they were here not by accident or luck, but by divine selection, chosen as seed for new creation, preserved because God had given his word, and God kept his word, even when circumstances suggested otherwise. Azariel watched this display of faith with something approaching awe, understanding that this was what differentiated Noah from the Nephilim, despite both possessing extraordinary qualities. The giants had strength and longevity, but no trust in anything beyond themselves, while Noah had ordinary human limitations, but absolute certainty in someone greater, and in the cosmic accounting that mattered. The latter proved infinitely more valuable than the former. As the Ark settled into patterns of survival, as the family adapted to their floating prison, and animals gradually calmed under routine care, Azariel made his decision. He would seal himself within the structure, would voluntarily enter suspension as witness to everything he'd observed, preserving not just memory, but his physical form as evidence that could someday, when humanity was ready, testify to what actually happened versus what mythology would make of it. He found a chamber in the Ark's deepest level, a space Noah had built according to divine instruction, but whose purpose the builder didn't fully understand. A room whose dimensions matched Azariel's form almost perfectly, suggesting God had designed it specifically for this purpose. The Watcher understood his mission now with complete clarity. His kind had been sent to observe creation, to witness and record, but not intervene. And this was the ultimate expression of that calling, to become living documentation, a primary source that would survive millennia until humans developed enough to understand what they'd lost, what they were in danger of losing again. He entered the chamber during the Ark's 40th day adrift, while Noah and his family slept exhausted from constant labor, while rain finally ceased after 40 days of relentless deluge and strange silence filled the air like held breath. Azariel carved inscriptions into the chamber walls using one crystalline fingernail, writing in the original language that predated Babel, documenting key facts, the date of the flood by celestial calculation, the reason for judgment, the names of the faithful 8 who survived, and most importantly the warning that sealed his purpose. Here sleeps the witness, until the waters are forgotten and men need reminding. Then he initiated the process, not death but something like it, lowering his metabolic functions to levels barely distinguishable from cessation, triggering biological responses that would create ice around his form despite the Ark's environment, ice that would preserve him perfectly through whatever came next, whether that was decades or centuries or millennia. His last conscious act before suspension was to reach out with senses that could perceive beyond physical barriers, to check on Noah one final time, to confirm that the family he'd helped save was safe and surviving. What he found instead caused his consciousness to recoil in horror, to nearly abort the suspension process because what he witnessed changed everything, revealed that survival and salvation weren't synonymous, that the flood had cleansed the Earth's surface, but not its depths. Through gaps in the Ark's planking, through spaces where joinery wasn't quite perfect, Azariel's enhanced vision penetrated the dark waters that now covered the planet to depths that drowned mountains. And in those depths he saw them, other Watchers, the rebels who had sired the Nephilim, who had corrupted humanity and triggered divine judgment. They weren't drowning, they were transforming, their forms shifting from anthropomorphic to something adapted for deep water, something that combined their original angelic nature with biology, suited for survival in hostile environments, becoming creatures that later generations would describe as demons or sea monsters or aliens depending on which mythology they encountered first. But worse than their survival was their preparation. Azariel's perception detected structures on the ocean floor, massive constructions of worked stone that predated the flood, that the rebel Watchers must have built in anticipation of what was coming, creating refuges in depths that would remain submerged even after waters receded, bases that would allow them to wait and plan and eventually return. He saw hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, diving into the abyssal zones with purpose that suggested coordination, planning, swimming toward their prepared sanctuaries while carrying artifacts and knowledge and corrupted genetics that they clearly intended to reintroduce when the opportunity arose. And one of them, as if sensing Azariel's observation, stopped mid-dive and turned, its transformed face no longer remotely humanoid, but still possessing intelligence, still capable of expression, and it smiled, a predatory expression that showed rows of teeth designed for tearing flesh. Telepathic communication crossed the distance between them, thought to thought without need for sound or medium. Well done, faithful one. Well done preserving the seed stock. 8 humans to rebuild from. Such perfect genetic material, uncorrupted, pure. We'll let them multiply for a few generations. Let them forget what really happened here. Let them spread across the earth thinking they're safe. And then, the rebel Watcher's smile widened, became something that would haunt Azariel through millennia of suspended consciousness. Then we'll return. Different methods this time, more subtle, learned from our mistakes. But the result will be the same. Humanity will be ours again. And next time, Your God won't be able to drown us out, because we'll be among them, within them, indistinguishable until it's too late. We'll call ourselves something different, visitors from other worlds perhaps, or hidden neighbors who've always been here. And they'll welcome us, these precious humans you're protecting, because they'll have forgotten why we were judged, forgotten that some angels fell and fell for a reason. Tell him we're coming back. Tell him we survived his reset. Tell him, the rebel watcher's mental voice dropped to something like whispered prophecy. Tell him we're patient, and we'll be ready when his next judgment comes. And this time, we won't lose. The telepathic contact severed as the rebel dove deeper, joining its fellows in the abyssal sanctuary. And Azariel completed his suspension process with consciousness, now burdened by knowledge that made his mission even more critical. The flood hadn't ended the conflict between the faithful and the fallen, had merely reset the battlefield, and his role as witness now included warning humanity that what they would dismiss as mythology or superstition or aliens was actually ancient evil that had adapted and survived. That was waiting for collective memory to fade before striking again. The ice formed around him with supernatural speed, not natural crystallization, but something accelerated by his own biology, creating a perfect, preserving medium that would maintain his form unchanged until whatever signal or condition God had established for his awakening finally occurred. His last thought before consciousness faded to a hibernation so deep it approximated death was a prayer. Lord, let them be ready. Let them remember. When the waters are forgotten and men need reminding, when you call me back from this long sleep, let humanity have grown enough to understand what really happened here, to grasp that the flood wasn't myth, but mercy, wasn't divine cruelty, but surgical removal of corruption that would have destroyed everything. And if the rebels return as they promise, when they return, because I know they will, let your people recognize them for what they are, not be deceived again, not make the same mistakes that drowned a world. The ice sealed completely, transforming Azariel into a statue, a monument, a time capsule containing testimony that would remain sealed for 4,300 years, waiting through the rise and fall of civilizations, through ages when humans would build pyramids and cities and technologies that approached what the antediluvian world had achieved, waiting until Marcus Holloway's hand would break the seal and the witness would awaken into a world that had indeed forgotten, that desperately needed reminding before history repeated itself with even more catastrophic consequences. I crashed back into my own consciousness, like breaking through ice into freezing water, the transition so violent and disorienting that my body convulsed, muscles spasming with neural signals that didn't know which century they belonged to, which identity they were supposed to animate. 17 minutes had passed in the chamber. I learned this later from Chen's frantic notes. But I had lived through 120 years of Azariel's memory, had experienced the construction of the Ark and the drowning of a world with such completeness that for several horrible seconds I couldn't remember which life was mine, couldn't distinguish between Marcus Holloway the soldier and Azariel the watcher who had observed humanity's near extinction. Blood poured from my nose in streams that splattered across my tactical vest, dripped from my ears in quantities that suggested ruptured vessels, and my eyes felt like they were bleeding too, though Chen later told me that was just burst capillaries making the whites crimson, giving me the appearance of someone who'd been beaten nearly to death. Pain radiated through my skull with intensity that made previous combat injuries feel like mild discomfort, not localized pain, but diffuse agony that suggested my brain had been fundamentally altered by exposure to memories no human neurology was designed to contain. I tried to speak, to tell them what I'd seen, but the words that came out weren't English. They were Proto-Hebrew, the original language that Azariel had known, syllables that hadn't been spoken aloud in 4,000 years emerging from my mouth with perfect pronunciation, despite having no conscious knowledge of what I was saying. Hanpilim Hayim, Hanoplim Shardiv, Hem Shabim. Azariel withdrew his hand from my forehead with visible effort, his translucent form seeming less luminous than before, as if the memory transfer had drained him of energy that 4 millennia of suspension had barely preserved. He stumbled slightly, catching himself with one 7-fingered hand against the chamber wall, leaving marks that glowed faintly where his skin made contact with the ancient wood, bioluminescent traces that faded slowly like afterimages. Dr. Chen and the soldiers had retreated to the chamber's perimeter, pressed against the curved walls with weapons raised in shaking hands. their faces showing terror that went beyond physical fear into existential horror. The expression of people who just watched reality restructure itself into shapes their worldviews couldn't accommodate. Chen was crying, her scientific composure completely shattered, repeating something under her breath that sounded like prayer or mantra or perhaps just denial. This isn't possible. This violates everything. This can't be real. This can't. But her eyes betrayed her, showed that she knew it was real, that the evidence standing luminescent before us couldn't be rationalized away, no matter how desperately her training demanded materialist explanations. I forced my mouth to form English words, pushed through the confusion of having two sets of memories competing for primacy in one human brain, managed to gasp out a warning that came from Azariel's final conscious moments. They didn't die. The fallen ones, the rebel watchers who sired the Nephilim, they survived the flood. They're still here. The chamber fell into silence, except for my ragged breathing and the distant sounds of the mountain settling around us. Everyone processing what I'd said, what it meant, what implications cascaded from that revelation like dominoes falling through history. Then Azariel moved to the chamber's center, raising both hands in a gesture I recognized from his memories as one used for teaching, for transmitting information to groups who needed to understand quickly and completely. His eyes brightened, pouring forth more intense light, and I felt pressure in my skull again. Not the overwhelming flood of memory this time, but gentler transmission, concepts being impressed directly into consciousness without need for verbal language, thoughts appearing fully formed like files being downloaded. Everyone in the chamber felt it simultaneously, judging by their expressions of shock and pain and dawning comprehension. Azariel was communicating telepathically with all of us at once, pushing information into our minds with angelic force that human neurology barely tolerated. The concepts came in rapid sequence, each one a revelation that would have taken hours to explain verbally, but which appeared complete in seconds. The rebel watchers hadn't drowned but adapted, transforming into forms that could survive deep water, retreating to structures they'd prepared in ocean trenches that remained submerged even after the floodwaters receded. They'd waded through millennia, occasionally surfacing to interfere with humanity in ways that got recorded as mythology, sea monsters, demons, malevolent spirits, but mostly remaining hidden, patient, learning from their previous mistakes when overt corruption had triggered divine judgment. Then in 1947, one of them had been detected, not surfacing voluntarily, but discovered accidentally when experimental radar systems penetrated ocean depths previously impervious to detection, when a rebel watcher's underwater facility near Roswell, New Mexico was exposed by technology that forced it to relocate, to come to land where it was spotted and eventually recovered after what humans interpreted as a crash, but was actually desperate flight from discovery. The being recovered at Roswell wasn't extraterrestrial, it was pre-terrestrial, one of the fallen watchers that had adapted its form to survive in hostile environments, that looked alien because angelic biology filtered through 4,000 years of adaptive evolution produced something that human categories couldn't adequately classify. The government's response had been to classify everything above top secret, to create programs like Umbra and Keyhole specifically to study what they'd found, but more importantly to suppress what it meant. If the Roswell being was real and matched biblical descriptions of fallen angels, then the Bible wasn't mythology, then God was real and active, and had previously judged humanity with global catastrophe, and if he'd done it once, he could do it again, and that truth was more terrifying to institutional power than any foreign enemy could ever be. The abduction phenomena that had accelerated since the 1960s weren't alien experiments. They were rebel watchers attempting to repeat their previous corruption, taking humans for genetic manipulation and hybridization, trying to reintroduce Nephilim bloodlines carefully, subtly, creating hybrids that could integrate into human society undetected, unlike their giant ancestors who'd been too obvious, too overt in their differences. And Azariel himself had awakened now, after 43 centuries of suspension, because the divine covenant that sealed him had specified conditions for his revival, until the waters are forgotten and men need reminding. Humanity had forgotten, had turned the flood into children's stories and cartoon animals, had dismissed divine judgment as primitive mythology, had reached technological levels approaching the antediluvian era, while simultaneously abandoning moral frameworks that had made that earlier civilization salvageable through Noah's faithful remnant. The rebel watchers were accelerating their plans, growing bold as collective memory faded, as fewer humans believed in God or accountability or judgment, setting the stage for corruption that would dwarf what Nephilim had achieved, because this time it would be hidden, integrated, normalized, until it was too late to resist. Azrael's awakening was alarm, was warning, was God's mercy giving humanity one last chance to remember what they'd forgotten before consequences became irreversible. The telepathic transmission ended abruptly, leaving all of us staggering under the weight of information we hadn't asked for, understanding we couldn't reject no matter how much we wanted to, knowledge that made every assumption about reality suspect, and every confident assertion about human history potentially wrong. Chen was the first to speak, her voice small and broken. So the government knows. They've known since 1947. They've been studying fallen angels thinking they're aliens, and they've suppressed the truth because, she laughed, a sound on the edge of hysteria, because admitting angels are real means admitting God is real, means admitting we're accountable to something beyond ourselves. It's not about alien technology or national security. It's about maintaining the illusion that we're the highest authority in the universe. Before anyone could respond, before we could even begin processing the magnitude of what we'd learned, sirens began screaming, not inside the chamber, but somewhere above us in the excavation site. Emergency klaxons that meant evacuation or attack or catastrophic structural failure. Colonel Patterson's voice exploded through our comms, louder than I'd ever heard it, stripped of professional calm and replaced with urgent command. All personnel, this is Threshold Actual. You are ordered to evacuate the chamber immediately and proceed to Extraction Point Alpha. We have hostile elements inbound. Static interrupted him. Then his voice returned even more urgent. Correction. We have authorization for site sterilization from CENTCOM. Turkish F-16s are en route with thermobaric ordnance. Impact in 12 minutes. Repeat, 12 minutes to site destruction. Anyone still in the excavation zone after that will not survive. Move now. The transmission cut off, leaving only static and the distant sound of sirens and, now that I was listening for it, the faint turbine whine of jet engines approaching from the west. Chen grabbed my arm hard enough to leave bruises, her face showing comprehension that came faster than mine. They're going to destroy everything, not just the chamber, not just Azrael. They're going to obliterate the entire excavation site, bury the evidence under tons of collapsed mountain, make sure nobody can ever verify what we found. She was shouting now, voice pitched high with panic and rage. They're going to kill the proof. They're going to kill all of us so we can't testify, can't tell anyone what we witnessed. The Ark, the inscriptions, Azrael. They're going to erase it all and call it a tragic accident, a natural avalanche or Turkish military error or whatever lie lets them sleep at night. The soldiers were already moving toward the exit, training overriding confusion, survival instinct kicking in despite the existential revelations still processing in background consciousness. But Azrael didn't follow, didn't show any sign of fear or urgency, despite clearly understanding what was coming. Instead, he turned to face me directly, those pupilless eyes pouring forth light that seemed to see not just my body, but my soul, evaluating something deeper than flesh, or loyalty, or courage. Then he moved with that fluid, inhuman grace, closing the distance between us in 2 steps that covered 10 feet, placing one 7-fingered hand on my shoulder with surprising gentleness, and I felt telepathic communication again, but this time private, directed only at me. You must witness, Marcus Holloway. As I witnessed Noah building his ark while the world mocked, as I witnessed the flood drowning civilization while 8 survived, as I witnessed the rebel watchers surviving what should have killed them, you must witness this moment, must survive to tell what you've learned, must carry the warning to a generation that has forgotten why forgetting is dangerous. His hand moved from my shoulder to press something into my palm, something small and hard and surprisingly heavy, and when I looked down, I saw a fragment of wood, ancient, blackened, preserved wood, carved with symbols that matched the chamber inscriptions, clearly torn from the ark itself, a physical piece of biblical history that carbon dating could verify, that spectroscopic analysis could authenticate, that represented proof no government could completely suppress. This is the covenant piece, Azrael's telepathic voice continued, his physical form beginning to glow more intensely as if preparing for something. It bears the marks I carved when Noah sealed the final joints, marks that will match inscriptions still visible in this chamber if any honest scientist examines them. It has survived 43 centuries, and it will survive what comes next. And you will survive to ensure it reaches people who will believe, who will test, who will understand what they're seeing. The rebel watchers want humanity to forget, want you to dismiss divine history as mythology, want you to accept their return as friendly visitors from space, rather than recognize them as ancient corruptors returning to finish what the flood interrupted. You now know the truth. You must testify. He turned toward the chamber wall opposite our entry point, placing both hands against ancient wood that looked solid and impenetrable. And I watched as the timber began to glow where he touched it, began to dissolve like the ice cocoon had dissolved, matter transforming into nothing, and revealing beyond it a narrow passage through rock that hadn't existed moments before. A tunnel leading upward into darkness that might be escape or might be death, but was definitely the only option. Besides, waiting for thermobaric weapons to incinerate us all. This way leads to the southern slope, Azariel communicated, gesturing toward the passage. The path is difficult, but you have 11 minutes to descend far enough that the blast wave will not reach you. I will remain here. My purpose was to be witness, to preserve testimony across millennia. That purpose is complete. You carry forward what I carried back. Now I must ensure the chamber seals properly, must protect the Ark's remains from complete destruction, so that someday when humanity is ready, they can return and verify your testimony against physical evidence. You're staying? Chen's voice cracked completely, showing attachment to this impossible being that had formed in minutes of contact, recognizing in Azariel something precious that was about to be lost. You survived 4,000 years. You can't just die now, you have more to teach us, more to… Azariel turned to her with expression that approximated sadness, though on his inhuman features it manifested as dimming of luminescence, as posture that suggested weight pressing down on shoulders designed to bear eternal burdens. Dr. Chen, I was never alive in the sense you mean. I was suspended, preserved, waiting to deliver a message that required 4 millennia to become necessary. That message is delivered. Marcus carries the proof forward. My remaining purpose is to be martyr if needed, to add my sacrifice to the testimony so that those who follow will understand the cost of truth, will recognize that some knowledge is worth dying to preserve. He looked at each of us in turn, his gaze lingering on me last and longest. The rebel watchers survived because they were willing to abandon their original forms, to adapt and hide and wait. I survived because I refused to change, because remaining true to purpose mattered more than comfort or safety, or even continued existence. Remember that distinction when they return openly, when they offer technology and evolution and transcendence in exchange for loyalty. Remember that those who change everything to survive eventually survive as something not worth being. Now go. 10 minutes remain. I will hold the chamber long enough for you to escape. We ran toward the passage Azariel had opened, stumbling over ancient wooden flooring that had supported Noah's family 4,000 years ago, our tactical lights cutting through darkness that seemed to resist illumination, as if the shadows themselves mourned what was about to be lost. Chen ran beside me, clutching her tablet like it contained salvation rather than data that would probably be classified and buried within hours of our extraction, while the other soldiers formed a protective formation born from training that operated even when rational thought had been obliterated by angelic revelations and biblical catastrophe made real. The tunnel entrance was narrow, barely wide enough for one person at a time, carved through solid rock with such precision that it couldn't be natural despite appearing to follow existing fissures. Another example of Azariel's limited manipulation of physical matter, creating escape routes where none existed because his covenant allowed protecting human life even when direct intervention was forbidden. I was third in line, just behind Corporal Williams and Sergeant Rodriguez, when movement ahead made everyone freeze. 2 soldiers who'd been with us since insertion, but who I now realized had maintained suspicious distance from group bonding, who'd never quite participated in the horrified wonder everyone else showed, were blocking the passage exit with M4 rifles raised and aimed directly at our center mass, their expressions cold and professional in ways that made my combat-trained instincts scream danger before my conscious mind processed what was happening. "Nobody moves," the taller one said, his accent marking him as East Coast, maybe Boston or Philadelphia, voice carrying the flat authority of someone delivering orders rather than making requests. By direct authorization of the National Security Agency and pursuant to executive orders under Umbra keyhole classification, all personnel with knowledge of Project Nephilim are hereby detained pending permanent security protocol implementation. The careful phrasing couldn't disguise what he meant. They were going to kill us, eliminate witnesses who could testify about what we'd found, what we'd learned, what implications cascaded from a frozen angel in Noah's Ark that confirmed every word of biblical history the government had spent decades teaching Americans to dismiss as mythology. His partner, shorter, stockier, with the build of someone who'd spent time in special operations before transitioning to intelligence work, kept his rifle trained on Dr. Chen specifically, laser sight painting a red dot directly over her heart. Dr. Chen, you're going to transfer all data from that tablet to this device, he said, producing a ruggedized USB drive from his tactical vest. And then we're going to secure the physical evidence Sergeant Holloway is carrying. After that, he glanced toward the chamber behind us where Azariel still stood luminescent and watching. After that, site sterilization will proceed as planned, and official records will show that everyone in this excavation died in a tragic structural collapse. Heroic soldiers and dedicated scientists lost in the pursuit of archaeological research. Your families will receive flags and medals, and the grateful thanks of a nation that will never know what you actually discovered. The chamber erupted into motion before conscious thought could intervene. Rodriguez lunging sideways to get a clear shot, Williams dropping prone to minimize his profile, me shoving Chen behind my body mass because she was civilian and unarmed, and represented more valuable testimony than any soldier. But before anyone could fire, before the tunnel could become an execution site where American soldiers murdered each other to protect secrets that were already corrupting the organizations meant to guard them, Azariel moved. He crossed 30 feet in less than a second, his form blurring with speed that human eyes couldn't properly track, interpositioning himself between the NSA agents and Dr. Chen, just as both rifles fired. The reports were deafening in the enclosed space, muzzle flashes painting the walls in strobe light violence, and I saw rounds impact Azariel's torso, saw his translucent flesh ripple from kinetic energy that should have torn through organs and shattered bones. But instead of blood, instead of tissue damage and hydraulic shock and all the predictable results of high-velocity rounds meeting living flesh, the wounds emitted light, pure white light that poured from entry holes like liquid luminescence, and the bullets themselves fell harmlessly to the floor after passing through his body, their kinetic energy somehow absorbed and negated by biology that didn't operate according to physics I understood. The NSA agents stared in shock that momentarily overrode their professional training, their carefully maintained composure shattering as they confronted something their intelligence briefings and weapons training and psychological conditioning hadn't prepared them for, target that absorbed gunfire and remained standing, that shouldn't exist, but undeniably did. Azariel raised both hands toward the tunnel ceiling, and I felt power gathering around him. Not electrical, not thermal, but something else. Something that made the air itself seem to vibrate at frequencies just below human hearing, that made my teeth ache and my bones resonate with sympathetic vibration. His eyes blazed brighter than I'd yet seen, pouring forth illumination so intense that everyone had to look away or be blinded. And when I could see again, the rock above the NSA agents was cracking, massive fissures spreading across granite that should have taken jackhammers and explosives to damage. Stone that had formed millions of years ago, suddenly giving way under forces that ignored its compressive strength and structural integrity. "Run!" Azariel commanded, his voice carrying harmonics that weren't vocal but rather telepathic, bypassing ears to resonate directly in consciousness. "Run now, all of you, while I hold the mountain. This passage will collapse in 20 seconds, sealing you from the chamber, protecting you from the blast that follows. Marcus Holloway." His eyes found mine through the chaos, held my gaze with intensity that communicated volumes. "You carry the covenant piece. You carry the testimony. You will survive because you must survive, because someone must tell them, must warn them, must make them remember before forgetting becomes fatal." The ceiling groaned. Massive slabs of rock held suspended by will alone, by angelic strength that had been diminished by millennia of hibernation, but still exceeded anything human. And the NSA agents finally broke, training giving way to survival instinct, as they scrambled backward into the chamber, abandoning their mission in favor of not being crushed. We ran, abandoning equipment and protocol and any pretense of military discipline. Pure flight response driving us through the tunnel as behind us, Azariel released his hold and tons of rock collapsed with sound, like the world ending, sealing the passage completely, cutting us off from the chamber and the ark and the being who had just sacrificed his continued existence to ensure we could testify. The tunnel angled upward steeply, forcing us to climb using hands and feet, scrambling over ice-slicked stone that Providence or Azariel's engineering had made just barely navigable, always ascending towards surface and safety and air that wasn't trapped 4,000 years in the past. Chen sobbed while she climbed, her scientist's mind probably cataloging everything lost. The inscriptions, the intact section of Ark, the opportunity to study angelic biology firsthand, all of it about to be erased by thermobaric weapons designed to incinerate targets so completely that forensic analysis became impossible. Behind us, muffled by hundreds of feet of rock and ice, I heard secondary explosions. The NSA agents must have had demolition charges, were probably trying to destroy as much evidence as possible before the airstrike hit, ensuring that even if we escaped, even if we testified, there would be nothing left to corroborate our claims, except the fragment burning in my pocket like a coal pulled from altar fire. Rodriguez was praying in Spanish, words I didn't understand but whose desperate sincerity needed no translation, while Williams kept looking back like he expected Azariel to somehow appear behind us, to have survived the collapse through more impossible angelic resilience. Then we burst from the tunnel exit onto the mountainside, emerging into freezing wind and moonless night under stars that looked different somehow, as if I was seeing them through eyes that remembered when their patterns were different, when humanity was younger, and the waters hadn't yet risen to drown the world. We were on the southern slope, perhaps a mile from the main excavation site, far enough that we might survive the blast if we descended quickly, if we put more mountain between ourselves and ground zero, where F-16s would soon deliver ordnance that would make the site look like a meteor impact. We ran downslope, sliding and falling and helping each other up, a unit bound by shared trauma and knowledge that would mark us as either witnesses or lunatics depending on who we told, what evidence we could produce, how much the government worked to discredit us. Then the sky lit up, not gradually, but instantly, night transforming into artificial noon as thermobaric weapons detonated above the excavation site, fuel-air explosives that created overpressure waves designed to propagate through tunnels and chambers and every enclosed space, igniting the oxygenated atmosphere itself and incinerating everything within the blast radius. The sound came seconds later, not a single explosion but sustained roar that went on impossibly long, pressure wave hitting us with force that knocked everyone flat despite being nearly 2 miles from impact point, heat washing over us like standing too close to a furnace, making exposed skin prickle and eyes water even through protective distance. When the blast finally dissipated, when I could hear again through the ringing in my ears and see again through the spots burned into my retinas, I forced myself to look back toward where the excavation had been. Nothing remained. The entire site had been erased, replaced by a crater that glowed faintly with residual heat, with fires burning in ice that shouldn't be able to burn, smoke rising in a pillar that looked almost biblical in its symbolism, like the smoke from Abraham's sacrifice, or the pillar that guided Israel through wilderness. The ark was gone, vaporized or buried under thousands of tons of collapsed mountain, and Azariel was gone, his 4,000-year mission complete, his sacrifice buying our escape and his testimony now living only in our memories and whatever fragment I carried. Chen was sitting in the snow, staring at the destruction with expression of absolute devastation, and I realized she was holding something, her crucifix, the same one I'd seen her praying with before, clutching it like it was the only solid thing in a world that had just revealed itself to be far more dangerous and far more holy than anything her education had prepared her for. "He saved us," she whispered, voice broken. "An angel saved us. A literal angel sacrificed himself so we could escape. How do we... She couldn't finish the thought. Couldn't articulate the impossibility of continuing normal life after witnessing what we'd witnessed. After being saved by a being from humanity's oldest stories made flesh and then turned back to light. But then I felt something. A presence that wasn't physical but was undeniably real. and I knew before turning that Azariel was somehow there despite having just been incinerated, was reaching across whatever distance separated matter from spirit to deliver one final message. My hand moved without conscious direction, pulling from my pocket the wooden fragment he'd given me, and in the firelight from the distant crater, I could see inscription carved into its surface, Hebrew letters that I somehow could read now, despite never studying the language. Knowledge bleeding over from the memories Azariel had shared. Chen leaned closer, translating aloud, even though I already knew what it said. Before the water came, he warned, when the water comes again, it will be fire. The verse was from 2 Peter 3:7, written 2,000 years after the flood by an apostle who somehow knew that the next judgment would be different, would use different elements but serve the same purpose, cleansing corruption that had grown too deep to excise any other way. Then Azariel's presence intensified, became almost overwhelming, and I felt his 7-fingered hand press against my forehead one final time despite his body being miles away dissolving into light. Felt another vision being transmitted with the last fragments of energy he could spare before whatever animated him finally dispersed back into whatever realm angels properly inhabited. The vision hit like hammer blow, instantaneous and overwhelming, and showing me things I desperately didn't want to see but couldn't refuse, couldn't block out because Azariel was burning his last strength to ensure I understood the full scope of what we faced. I saw ocean depths, abyssal zones where sunlight had never penetrated in all of Earth's history, and in those depths were structures, massive constructions of stone and metal, and materials I couldn't identify, built with engineering that made modern architecture look primitive, stretching for miles along the ocean floor like cities designed for populations that numbered in millions rather than thousands. And moving through those structures were beings that resembled Azariel, but corrupted, twisted, their translucent forms showing beneath the skin not bioluminescent beauty, but something darker, systems that pulsed with sickly colors, faces that had lost any resemblance to the image of God they'd once reflected. These were the rebel watchers, the fallen ones who'd survived the flood and spent 4,000 years adapting, planning, building towards something whose purpose I couldn't fully grasp, but whose scale was terrifying. They moved with purpose, with coordination that suggested hive mind or shared consciousness, working on construction projects that looked half technological and half organic, growing structures as much as building them. And everywhere I looked there were more. Thousands, tens of thousands, perhaps millions of them, a population that had multiplied in the deep places while humanity thought itself alone on the planet. And they were counting down to something, preparing for something, building toward a moment whose arrival felt imminent in ways that transcended rational prediction. I saw symbols I couldn't read but whose meaning bypassed linguistic understanding and implanted itself directly as comprehension. Less than 10 years remained, maybe less than 5, before whatever they were preparing would reach completion, before they would surface en masse and present themselves to humanity as, the vision showed me, visitors from other worlds, ancient neighbors who'd always been here, friends offering technology and evolution and solutions to every human problem in exchange, for loyalty and integration and genetic modification that would repeat the Nephilim corruption under scientific rather than mystical framing. And they would succeed because humanity had forgotten, because we'd dismissed the flood as mythology and angels as superstition, because we'd built entire scientific paradigms on the assumption that we were alone in the universe, and that any visitors must be extraterrestrial rather than pre-terrestrial, ancient rather than alien, biblical rather than novel. The vision showed me humans welcoming them, saw world leaders signing treaties, and scientists accepting gene therapy, and populations lining up for enhancement that promised longer life and greater ability, but delivered corruption that would make previous Nephilim hybridization look crude by comparison. Then Azariel's presence spoke one final time, his telepathic voice weak and fading but carrying weight that made his previous communications feel tentative by comparison. The first flood came to cleanse corruption that was obvious, giants ruling as tyrants, violence filling the earth, wickedness visible to any honest observer. It was mercy because humanity could still recognize evil, could still identify what needed cleansing. But the corruption they're planning now will be subtle, integrated, normalized, until questioning it seems backward or hateful or unscientific. They've learned from their previous failure. Don't rule openly. Don't create monsters that look monstrous. Don't give God's people obvious targets to resist. Instead, infiltrate gradually, offer solutions that seem purely beneficial, frame corruption as evolution and judgment as progress until the day humanity wakes up and realizes they've already been transformed into something God didn't create and can't redeem. His presence was dissipating now, spreading thinner as whatever cohesion held his consciousness together after his body's destruction finally gave way. The flood was God's judgment on a world that had become fully corrupted. But it was also his mercy, because he acted while there was still one family worth saving, still genetic stock uncorrupted enough to restart from. The next judgment, when it comes, and it will come because they will push too far, and humanity will forget too much, won't be water. It will be fire, as Peter prophesied, and it will be test rather than cleansing. God will allow them to surface, allow them to make their offer, allow humanity to choose. Will you trust the Creator who once drowned a world to save 8 faithful souls? Or will you trust the deceivers who offer godhood without accountability, evolution without cost, transcendence without submission to anything beyond yourself? Noah was tested by being asked to believe rain would fall when it never had. Your generation will be tested by being asked to reject progress that looks beneficial, to refuse evolution that seems advantageous, to choose covenant with an invisible God over partnership with visible beings offering everything human nature craves. Most will fail that test, Marcus. Most will choose what the rebels offer, but some won't. There will be a remnant, just as Noah was a remnant. You must help them recognize the test when it comes. You must remind them what forgetting cost humanity before. You must be witness, as I was witness. Now, his presence flickered like candle in wind. Now I must go. My purpose is complete. Tell them, remember, choose well. And then he was gone, truly gone. Presence dissipating into nothing, leaving only cold mountain air and distant fire and the terrible weight of knowledge I'd never asked for but couldn't refuse. The tunnel descended deeper into the mountain's core before angling southward, taking us 2 kilometers through passages that alternated between natural fissures and sections that looked worked, shaped, as if Azariel or others like him had modified the mountain's geology across millennia to create escape routes that would only be needed once but needed to be perfect when that moment came. We moved in silence except for labored breathing and the scrape of boots on stone, each of us processing trauma in our own way. Rodriguez muttering prayers that had progressed from Spanish to Latin, as if reaching for older, more fundamental language to express what we'd experienced. Williams checking his medical supplies compulsively, looking for wounds to treat, because physical injuries were comprehensible in ways that angelic sacrifice and biblical vindication weren't. Chen stumbling knee. Frequently, her scientific worldview so thoroughly shattered that basic motor coordination seemed to require conscious effort, where it had previously been automatic. I led the group by default of rank, and by virtue of carrying the fragment that burned in my pocket with heat that wasn't physical but felt real anyway. Azariel's final gift and terrible burden that made me both witness and target, both testifier and marked man. After what felt like hours but my watch insisted was only 47 minutes, we emerged from a crack in the mountain's southern face so narrow we had to squeeze through sideways, spilling out into a ravine 3,000 feet below the excavation site, far enough from ground zero that the thermobaric blast had merely been deafening rather than fatal, had showered us with debris rather than vaporizing us along with everything else. The explosion site still glowed on the mountain above us, visible as a pulsing orange wound against black stone and white ice, and even from this distance I could feel residual heat, could smell burning that combined stone and ice and organic matter in a combination that shouldn't exist, that suggested temperatures hot enough to fuse granite into glass. The official story was being written even as we watched, I realized. Already I could hear helicopter rotors approaching from multiple directions, could see searchlights beginning to sweep the mountain slopes, could imagine the press releases being drafted in Ankara and Washington describing a tragic avalanche triggered by instability from the excavation work, expressing deepest condolences to the families of 6 soldiers and 2 scientists who gave their lives in the pursuit of archaeological knowledge, promising investigations and reviews that would find no fault and recommend no changes, because the incident was simply tragic accident rather than deliberate erasure of evidence that threatened comfortable narratives about humanity's past and present and future. Rodriguez heard the helicopters too, looked at me with expression that communicated what we both understood. Those choppers weren't coming to rescue us. They were coming to clean up survivors, to ensure that anyone who'd witnessed what we'd witnessed either died on the mountain or disappeared into intelligence apparatus that would erase us more thoroughly than the thermobaric weapons had erased the Ark. "We need to hide," I said quietly, gesturing toward an overhang that might provide concealment from aerial surveillance. But before we could move, before survival instinct could override exhaustion and trauma, the nearest helicopter swung around with spotlight painting our position in brilliant white illumination that made hiding pointless. The helicopter bore Turkish military markings, but the men who fast-roped down carried themselves with the professional efficiency of special operations regardless of nationality, moving with coordination that spoke of extensive training and recent combat experience. They surrounded us with weapons lowered but ready, not threatening but making clear that resistance would be both futile and potentially fatal. And the team leader, a captain whose English carried British undertones suggesting NATO training, addressed us with carefully neutral tone. "Sergeant Holloway, Dr. Chen, we have orders to extract you for medical evaluation and debriefing following the tragic accident that claimed your colleagues' lives. Please board the aircraft immediately. You're all suffering from shock and exposure, and we need to get you to proper medical facilities before conditions deteriorate further." Everything about his delivery was reasonable, professional, exactly what you'd expect from rescue operations. But his eyes told different story. Cold evaluation that measured us as problems to be solved, rather than survivors to be saved. Calculation that weighed whether we were cooperative assets or resistant threats. Chen opened her mouth to protest, to say something about evidence or truth or the injustice of erasing what we'd found. But I grabbed her arm hard enough to communicate urgency without words, shook my head fractionally because arguing now would only confirm we were resistant threats, would mark us for immediate elimination rather than the slower erasure that cooperative compliance might delay. "Thank you, Captain," I said, supporting Chen as we moved toward the helicopter because she was stumbling again, either from exhaustion or from the crushing realization that we'd escaped Azariel's sacrifice only to fall into institutional machinery designed specifically to grind truth into classified dust. They flew us to Ankara, to a military hospital that looked modern and well-equipped, but felt more like a prison, with guards stationed outside every door and windows that didn't open, and that sensation of being constantly monitored even when alone. Chen was separated from me immediately. Different medical needs, they claimed. Female medical staff for Dr. Chen's comfort. And I didn't see her again. Didn't know if she was even still in the building, or had been moved elsewhere, or had simply disappeared into whatever black site infrastructure the joint U.S.-Turkish intelligence apparatus maintained for problems that couldn't be solved through legal channels. They kept me in an observation room for 72 hours, bringing military doctors who checked vitals and neurological responses with professional thoroughness, while asking casual questions that weren't casual at all. "What do you remember about the explosion? Did you experience any unusual symptoms before the structural collapse? Some survivors of traumatic events report hallucinations or false memories. Did you experience anything like that?" I gave them nothing useful. Stuck to basics. That would be in official reports anyway. Went into chamber, experienced cave-in, escaped through natural tunnels. Traumatic but unremarkable in the ways that mattered. Nothing to see here, just another soldier who survived something horrible through luck and training. But they weren't satisfied. Kept circling back to the same questions with slight variations, looking for inconsistencies that would indicate I was hiding information or had been compromised by whatever they thought might have occurred in that chamber. On the third day, they brought out the barbiturates, medical interrogation that couldn't legally happen to American military personnel on American soil, but which could occur in foreign facilities under joint operational agreements that existed in classification levels above my clearance to question. The injection burned going in. Sodium pentothal or something more modern. Something designed to lower inhibitions and make lying difficult by interfering with the frontal lobe's ability to construct coherent deception. I felt myself going under, felt control slipping as the interrogators, no longer pretending to be medical staff, now clearly intelligence officers with American accents and questions that came from briefing books rather than medical protocols, began asking what I'd really seen in the chamber, what Dr. Chen had translated, what the specimen had communicated, whether I'd retained any physical evidence. The drug made resistance hard but not impossible. I'd had SEER training, survival, evasion, resistance. escape, that included chemical interrogation techniques, had learned methods for maintaining operational security even under pharmacological influence. I gave them fragments, pieces of truth mixed with confusion and misdirection. Yes, there was a chamber. Yes, there were inscriptions. Yes, there was something biological that had been preserved in ice. No, I didn't understand what it was. No, I didn't retain any physical evidence. No, Dr. Chen didn't have time to complete her translations before the collapse occurred. The interrogators pressed harder, increased dosages, brought in specialists who asked the same questions in different orders looking for contradictions. But I held the core secret, held knowledge of what Azariel actually was, what he'd shown me, what he'd given me, because revealing that would mean immediate permanent disappearance, would confirm I was threat, rather than merely traumatized survivor. They kept me isolated for 2 more weeks, during which time the outside world moved on and forgot, during which time the news cycle processed and discarded the story of tragic archaeological accident in Turkey, during which time memorials were held, and flags were presented to families who believed their sons and daughters had died in service of science rather than been murdered to protect institutional lies. I learned about Chen's death through a newspaper they left in my room, probably deliberate, testing to see how I'd react, watching through cameras to measure grief or rage or guilt that might indicate deeper connection than official records showed. The article was small, buried on page 6 of the international section. American geologist dies in Istanbul traffic accident. Dr. Sarah Chen, age 40, killed when her rental car was struck by a truck whose driver fled the scene, tragic end to a distinguished career, survived by elderly parents in California who must be devastated, but whose devastation wouldn't be eased by knowing their daughter had died because she'd seen proof that angels were real and governments preferred that proof stay buried. I stared at that article until the words blurred, feeling grief and rage in equal measure, knowing with absolute certainty that it hadn't been accident, knowing that Chen had been allowed to escape from wherever they'd held her specifically, so her death could be staged as tragedy rather than execution, specifically so anyone investigating would find traffic accident rather than assassination, specifically so the message would be clear to me: cooperate or join her. The discharge came on day 17, processed with bureaucratic efficiency that would have been impressive if it weren't so chilling in its implications. Honorable discharge on medical grounds, psychological trauma from combat-adjacent incident, eligible for full pension and veterans' benefits, required to sign non-disclosure agreements that made clear any discussion of Operation Threshold would be prosecuted as treason under Espionage Act provisions that carried death penalty for violations. They presented it as generous, as taking care of a soldier who'd served faithfully and deserved comfortable retirement after traumatic experience, but the subtext was threat. Accept this golden cage or die like Chen died. Choose silence and comfort or truth and elimination. Decide right now which you valued more because there were no third options and no second chances. I signed everything they put in front of me, played the part of grateful soldier accepting gracious treatment, thanked the right officers and said the right words about being ready to move on and put the tragedy behind me. They gave me civilian clothes to replace my uniform, returned my personal effects in a sealed bag, escorted me to Ankara Airport with plane ticket to Dover Air Force Base, and from there to civilian connection to anywhere I wanted to start my new life. The escort stayed until I boarded, watching to ensure I actually left, and only when the plane was taxiing did I finally feel safe enough to check the personal effects they'd returned. The jacket was mine, the one I'd been wearing under my tactical gear during the operation. Familiar weight and worn fabric that I'd owned for 6 years. But in the interior pocket, folded small and careful, was a piece of paper in handwriting I recognized immediately as Chen's, her characteristic precise script that reflected years of filling laboratory notebooks, cramped and efficient to fit maximum information in minimum space. The note was brief, written in what must have been desperate hurry. Fragment is in Genesis 6:3. Cole.online, Arc Witness 2024. Dead man's switch activates if I don't check in for 7 days. Everything's there. Photos, videos, carbon dating results, spectroscopic analysis, translations, witness testimony. They killed the messenger, Marcus. Don't let the message die. Azariel said we must witness. So witness. Tell them what we found. Make them remember. Sarah. My hands shook reading it, understanding hitting with force that made my vision blur. Chen had known they would kill her, had prepared for it, had set up insurance that would release everything if she disappeared or died, had turned her murder into the very thing they'd killed her to prevent, public exposure of what we'd found. Genesis 6:3, she'd written. And I knew the verse even before pulling up Bible app on the phone they'd graciously returned to me. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. The verse right before God decided to send the flood, the warning that preceded judgment, the last chance humanity received before water rose to drown a corrupted world. I waited until I was back in the United States, until I'd reached a location where surveillance would be slightly less comprehensive than in Turkey or on military base, then accessed the URL Chen had provided using VPN and encryption that would make tracking difficult, though not impossible for agencies with NSA-level resources. The website loaded slowly, revealing a simple interface that looked deliberately amateur, designed to appear like conspiracy theory site that could be dismissed by mainstream observers, but which would attract exactly the people who needed to see it. Truth seekers, whistleblowers, those already suspicious of official narratives. And there it was. Everything Chen had promised. Everything they'd killed her to suppress. Photographs of the Ark's exterior showing dimensions and construction that matched biblical specifications exactly. Carbon dating results from multiple independent laboratories, all confirming 2348 BCE plus 67 years, spectroscopic analysis of the wood showing species and treatment that shouldn't exist in that region or era, thermal imaging of the sealed chamber showing biological heat signature before we'd breached it, and most damning of all, video footage from Chen's body camera showing Azariel's emergence from the ice, showing him communicating, showing the moment when he'd touched my forehead and transferred memories that human neurology wasn't designed to contain. The last file was audio, Chen's voice recorded in what must have been her final hours, speaking with the calm of someone who'd accepted death but refused to let truth die with her. My name is Dr. Sarah Chen, USGS geologist assigned to Operation Threshold. What you're seeing isn't fabrication or digital manipulation. It's physical evidence that Noah's Ark existed, that it contained something preserved for 4,000 years, that biblical history is literally true in ways that will force us to reconsider everything we think we know about humanity's past and present and future. They will say, I'm crazy. They will say, I fabricated this for attention, or money, or mental illness. They will point to my death as evidence that I was unstable. But the evidence speaks for itself. Carbon date it, verify it, test it against every skeptical framework you can imagine. It will hold because it's real. And if it's real, if the Ark is real and the flood was real and angels are real, then everything else is real too. Accountability, judgment, the test that's coming when the rebels surface and offer humanity everything it wants in exchange for everything it is. Marcus Holloway survived. He carries physical evidence. Find him. Protect him. Let him testify. Don't let them erase what we found. Don't let them... The recording cut off abruptly, suggesting Chen had run out of time or been interrupted. But the message was clear, and the evidence was comprehensive, and now it was public, distributed across servers that mirrored and replicated faster than any government could suppress, spreading through networks of people who'd been waiting for proof of exactly this kind of conspiracy, exactly this kind of cover-up. I sat in that anonymous hotel room, staring at the screen long after I'd reviewed every file, understanding that Chen's sacrifice had just made me the most wanted witness in the world, wanted by intelligence agencies that would kill to keep me silent, wanted by truth seekers who would demand I testify publicly, wanted by media that would either platform or destroy me depending on which narrative served their interests, wanted by everyone except the people who might actually benefit from the warning Azariel had died to deliver. The fragment in my pocket felt heavier now, its weight metaphysical rather than physical, pressing down with the accumulated burden of 4,000 years of testimony, of 100 years of Noah's faithful construction, of Azariel's millennia-long sleep and final sacrifice, of Chen's murder and carefully planned resurrection of truth through Dead Man's Switch. I was the witness now, the one who carried forward what they'd carried back, the living testimony that connected ancient judgment to coming test. And I had two choices, exactly two, no more and no less. I could disappear, change my identity, take the pension and vanish into anonymous American life, and let the evidence speak for itself without my corroboration. Or I could step forward, put my face and name and testimony into public record, become the target that Chen had become but with forewarning she hadn't had, with preparation that might let me survive long enough to actually deliver the message before they silenced me too. Outside my hotel window, America went about its business, people living normal lives in normal ways, completely unaware that ancient evil was counting down toward surfacing, toward offering them evolution and transcendence and everything human nature craved, toward repeating corruption that had once drowned the world but would this time succeed because they'd learned subtlety, because humanity had learned forgetting. Tell them, Azariel had commanded. Make them remember, Chen had written. Witness, they'd both insisted, as if testimony alone could turn the tide, as if speaking truth into a world that preferred lies could somehow prepare the remnant that would be tested, that would need to choose covenant with invisible God over partnership with visible beings offering everything except accountability. I pulled out the fragment, traced the inscription with fingers that still trembled. Before the water came, he warned, when the water comes again, it will be fire. Then I made my decision, opened my laptop, and began writing what you're reading now, because if they were going to kill me anyway, and they were, either quickly if I stayed silent or slowly if I spoke, I might as well make the death mean something. Might as well spend my final days or months doing what Azariel did for 4,000 years, witnessing, remembering, warning those who still had ears to hear.